This exciting and dramatic story took place in the Empire of Xerxes, a state that was famous for both its wise men and its warriors. A legend about ancient families' secret conspiracies intrigues love devotion and true human friendship. The most famous were two duchies, Parquet and Serpente, located next to each other. The House of Parks was famous for its valiant warriors, wise military leaders and commanders, and the Serpente family tree captured the imagination with its untold wealth and ability to extract hard cash from any business. The Parks were more numerous, but the Serpentes, although in the minority, headed the largest bank in the Xerxes Empire, called Python. The main character of the work, Adriana, came from a family of military leaders, and once her family was one of those who created this country. The girl was the only daughter in the family, but after the death of her beloved mother, a stepmother and her son appeared in the house, and then everything began to change, especially after the sudden death of her biological father, the last hope and support of the young heiress of the family. But the pain of losing her loved ones did not break Adriana, and she continued to care for the poor and help the weak. Serving the common people brought the girl to the capital, where despite the outbreak of the plague, she continued to do charity work, and there she met the first prince. The fair-haired crown prince was also one of the main characters in the work. The young man, as well as Adriana, will have to fight with opponents and the aggressive behavior of various characters. It will be very difficult for the heir of royal blood to overcome the secret and open resistance of some of them. The destinies of this young couple will be so closely intertwined that people around them will say that these are two halves who have finally found each other. But no legend is complete without the forces of evil that constantly interfere with and oppose the main characters. In our story, these are the two brothers of the Serpente family. During the plague epidemic, these characters left the country and spent several years away from home, only to return one day. But they were not alone. With them was a girl, the mistress of intrigues and plots, who was able to bring the empire to the brink of destruction. Her name is Emilia Sanchez, better known as the Snake Mistress, and one of the most cunning women in the entire kingdom. However, over time, the villains receive the punishment they deserve, and retribution for all their sins which are washed away with blood. However, the story of this trinity is much more complex and interesting than it might seem at first glance. Serpente family estate blocking out the rays of the sun. The young men discussed the series of deaths that had befallen many noble families, including the imperial family. An epidemic of a terrible disease swept across the country, sparing neither rich nor poor, including the empress, as well as the Duke and Duchess of Serpente. The children and their servants remembered how well they had lived before, when their parents were alive, and thought about the trials that lay ahead. The red-haired girl stood over the grave and hugged the young lady secretly. She regretted that she could not help her mistress in any way, and she died. Her mother worked for the Serpente family for many years as a nanny, looking after the children and helping the young heirs grow up. The Duke and Duchess always treated their servants kindly, so the girl lived and worked in comfortable conditions. But one day, something terrible happened. It was such a terrible experience that it was not even stored in memory. This is how the mind tried to protect itself from the trauma. Over the years, these memories returned again and again, until finally they became clear and frightening. Because having realized them, the nanny's daughter realized that she had come here from another world. She was once an orphan without a single family member in the whole wide world, and died on a cold night after an elevator got stuck, and she froze to death in it. And on the very day when the daughter of the servant in the Serpente house lost her mother to illness, she fully remembered her past life and realized that she had been miraculously transported to a new world, into a universe where there were kings, nobles, and servants into the world that was described in the novel that the poor girl read shortly before her death in the elevator. Her whole life literally shattered into tiny pieces, because everything she believed in turned out to be an illusion far from reality, but she had no other life. And then the girl decided to live this new life with dignity, and therefore swore on the grave of her masters, the Duke and Duchess, that she would take care of their offspring as her mother did. The silent walls of the ancient castle had seen many human destinies, but this turn of events was new even for them. After a night's sleep, the girl's long hair was scattered across the blanket and pillow. When the awakened one opened her eyes, she saw in front of her a young female face of a girl with blue hair. It was very familiar to her. The maid sat up on the bed and began to look around. The surroundings were completely unfamiliar, and she did not understand where she was. Then she turned her gaze to the child who was sleeping peacefully next to her. The baby's name was Estelle, and apparently last night she lay down next to her and simply fell asleep. Soon, the little blue-haired lady also began to slowly open her eyes and wake up from her sleep. Finally, the girl who was already 12 years old at the time stood up and asked in surprise why Amelia was in her bed. The older girl smiled and noted that it was quite the opposite, because it was Estelle who had come to her last night and fallen asleep on her bed. The other children heard the girls' voices coming from the room and went to look for them. The boys followed the sound and soon found themselves at the door. Then one of them pulled on a large iron ring that served as a handle, and it began to open. The boys looked at the girls in surprise and said that they came as soon as they heard them, although they themselves had woken up a long time ago. Amelia turned to the boy with blue hair. His name was Lethies, and he was 15 years old, and asked how long they had been here. In response, the teenager propped his cheek up with his hand and said that he didn't like the joke she had come up with because the place didn't look interesting at all, but rather resembled the lair of a scary monster. Benja, the younger brother, who was 14 years old, joined the conversation and noticed that his relative was saying stupid things, although he should be a shining example of intelligence. Then the boy said that they had recently woken up in an unfamiliar room, and it was very strange because he didn't remember how they got there. Amelia turned to her charge Estelle and thought that there must be some reasonable explanation for what was happening. It just needed to be found. The second son sat down and leaned back in his chair, and then heard Lethies ask if such a room could be located on the territory of their own estate. However, Benja abruptly interrupted his older brother, saying that this was their home, and it couldn't be that they had never visited here in all these years. Faced with such rude treatment, Lethies immediately jumped up and started yelling at his brother, while the girls stood to the side and watched the boys quarrel. Amelia thought that the question of her first son made sense, because in all the years of working in the Serpente family home, she had never been there, although she walked a lot throughout the territory on behalf of her mother. And while the nanny's daughter was trying to remember the events of the previous day, after the funeral of her young master's parents, one of the brothers approached her and put his hand on her shoulder. Lethies smiled cheerfully and said that this joke from the servants was quite unexpected, but he believed that they should return home to their familiar surroundings. Amelia laughed and replied that she had never even thought of such a thing because it was a very strange prank, and even more so on the descendants of a noble family. The next moment, Estelle came up from behind and pulled her older friend by the sleeve. When the girl turned around, the little girl drew her attention to the fact that it had become difficult to breathe in the room. Amelia patted the young lady on the head, smiled, and said that the room was indeed a little uncomfortable, but it was okay. But Estelle frowned and noticed that she didn't see the slightest reason for joy, because she was scared here and wanted to get out of here as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Benja noticed that all this looked very strange, because he and his brother woke up on the ground floor, and by the time they reached the girls' room, they had time to look around a little. Amelia raised her finger and added that the young people were simply inattentive, because somewhere there must be a door through which they got here, which means they can also leave through it. The older brother noticed that they looked into every room, and also said that they managed to find a dining room and a bathroom, but they did not see any escape doors. Lethies then smiled and noted that if they had missed anything, it was his inattentive younger brother's fault. Benja looked indulgently at his relative, making fun of him, but said nothing. He then suggested that the whole company go down to the lower floor and resume the search, and so they did. As the children descended, Amelia noticed that it was indeed becoming difficult to breathe. The room was definitely stuffy. Everyone looked at their surroundings in surprise and covered their mouths with their hands. The nanny's daughter noted to herself that in all the places where doors should have been located, there were ordinary walls. Suddenly, one of the boys accidentally stepped on a piece of glass, which crunched loudly and broke into several pieces. This sharp and unexpected sound scared the girls very much, causing them to shudder and scream loudly. For a moment, everyone froze. But suddenly, Lethies was overcome with a fit of laughter that he didn't even try to hold back. Benja immediately supported his brother, and they began to laugh loudly at the girls, accusing them of being afraid of any noise, while Amelia hugged Estelle and tried to defend herself from the attacks. However, the elder brother folded his arms across his chest and replied that they were very stupid and naive, and therefore deserved to be laughed at. Moreover, the boy accused the girls of sounding like the squeal of animals when they were scared. Amelia tolerated the bullying for a while, but then decided to put an end to it and opened her mouth to speak out in her own defense. But instead of starting to speak, the girl froze because her gaze was drawn to an unusual object located behind Latias. Behind the heir of Serpente, there was a large rectangular mirror. It was located on the stone wall. Meanwhile, Estelle approached her brother and asked why he was hurting them. Amelia walked towards the find and ran her hand over the smooth surface of the mirror. Such a large object clearly did not fit into the surrounding environment. Nevertheless, it was in front of her. The floor mirror was not just big, but huge, even for an adult, and the child seemed microscopic against its background. The nanny's daughter looked at him and could not look away, because there was something mesmerizing about him. The other children also came closer and began to silently examine their reflection. Benja came up from behind and touched Amelia, asking if she was okay. The girl turned around and replied that everything was fine, and then suggested that they had been placed in this strange place for their safety to wait out the plague. The second son confirmed that they could have been moved to this place for protection so that they could wait out the disease raging around them, and this was done by their relatives while the children were sleeping. The nanny's daughter looked at the young gentleman in the reflection of the mirror and asked if he remembered anything important that his relatives had said to the boy the night before. The boy remembered that their relatives had asked them all to stay on the estate because they were afraid of losing them to an illness they might contract if they returned to the capital. Amelia remembered that the novel she had read in her previous life said very little about what happened to children after their parents died. Suddenly, that very episode came into my head, in which it was said that the children, after the death of the Duke and Duchess, went to another country to study, but no details of their lives were given there. The young maid noted with horror that she had absolutely no idea what was going to happen to her and her masters over the next 2 years. Hoping to find at least some information, the nanny's daughter asked Benya again if his family had told him anything else the night before, and the guy replied that he had asked for Amelia to be sent on a trip abroad with them because someone had to look after the emotional Estelle. Suddenly, some strange mechanical sounds were heard behind the glass. Something was quietly clicking and moving. Everyone fell silent and looked in surprise at the reflective surface, which apparently was preparing a surprise for them. The little heiress of Serpente was the most worried of all. The girl pointed at the mirror in horror and asked her brothers and the maid if they heard these strange and frightening sounds. Amelia and Benja listened warily to the incomprehensible mechanism that apparently was being activated right before their eyes. The maid tried to remember the novel she had read and find there at least something that could give her a clue to the solution to this mysterious situation in which they found themselves. At some point, the sounds died down, and then the mirror rectangle opened like an ordinary door. A bright light came from the opening that had formed so the heirs of Serpente could not see anything. Then the young people heard a question asking them where they were. Amelia couldn't immediately make out the person speaking, but the voice itself seemed very familiar to her. Soon a silhouette appeared on the threshold, and everyone recognized this thin man because it was Viscount Jerome Ivar, the uncle of the heirs of the Serpente family. The nanny's daughter could easily recall the episode from the novel when little Estelle was in the garden and suddenly began to cry. The relative immediately approached the girl, bent down to her, and asked what was the reason for the child's tears, to which he received the answer that the little girl missed her Wendy doll. The man stood up and smiled. He remembered this cheerful pink bunny that the child had recently been given, and which his niece had really liked. A servant was sent for the toy, and very soon the quick steps of the nanny's daughter could be heard, who was hurrying to carry out this important task as quickly as possible. The Duchess happily raised her finger and said that very soon her daughter's mood would noticeably improve. Amelia bowed politely and looked down. Her breath was out of breath from the rush, but she tried not to show that it was not easy for her to run around the entire state looking for the doll. The toy was immediately given into the girl's hands, and her face instantly cleared up, and the tears disappeared as if they had never been there. The uncle stroked his niece's head and gently reminded her that you need to constantly take care of those you love so as not to cry later. Estelle promised not to forget the toy again. Amelia remembered that the young heirs of the family loved Uncle Jerome very much because he always found an opportunity to devote a little time to them and communicate. That's why the nanny's daughter was very happy to see this man in such an incomprehensible situation because he could be trusted. However, despite the positive emotions, the maid still really wanted to find out what happened and why they were here. The first of the children to speak was Benja. He said that he was pleased to see a relative because they had already begun to worry and make up all sorts of scary stories. Then Estelle spoke up, made a pitiful expression on her face, and said that she was very hungry and there was not enough air in the room, so she felt unwell. Looking straight into Viscount Ivar's face, the little girl noticed that she wanted to get out of here as soon as possible so that she could at least breathe normally. All this time, Amelia carefully watched the expression on her master's face and already understood that he had clearly bad news for them. Letias also noticed Ivar's behavior and began to ask him about what would happen next. Jerome replied that he had come to them personally to explain and tell them something, and then offered to go with him and talk. The spacious dining room, with a high ceiling under which were powerful wooden beams and a heavy iron chandelier, was chosen as the place for the dialogue. The door to the outside, which was located behind the mirror surface, remained open. When everyone was seated at the dinner table, Uncle noted that he understood their surprise and concern because they suddenly found themselves in a completely unfamiliar place. Ivar added that the change of scenery was a serious but necessary step for the heirs of Serpente. Amelia looked a little confused because she thought she knew almost everything about the characters in this novel. But suddenly, this story began to present surprises. Benja noticed that they were all really worried because it was all so unexpected and sudden, and then asked if this shelter was on their estate. Estelle and her maid were surprised to hear Uncle Ivar confirm that this multi-story building was located in the estate in a secret place, and that other wealthy families had similar ones. The children listened attentively to their relative and then asked when they would be able to get out of this uncomfortable room. The Viscount did not answer right away. It was obvious that he was having a hard time choosing his words, but he still said that their plans to send their children to study abroad had to be revised. Obviously, the children were not happy with such news. Benja immediately asked Jerome, in fear to clarify how exactly their future fate would change. The uncle replied that the plague was currently raging in the capital, so taking the heirs of Serpente to the port located there was very dangerous, so the relatives came up with another way to protect them. Ivar added that their parents, as well as the supreme ruler, tried to sit out the situation in their residences, and this is what it led to. The disease somehow reached them through other people, and despite all the precautions they took, the infection still caught up with them and killed them, which means the mirror of their life was broken forever, but their descendants must avoid a similar fate. Jerome noted that people still do not know how the disease is transmitted, and therefore many regard the disease as a punishment from above, but they will try to save the children. The Viscount added that small children are particularly easily infected and die quickly, so the family decided to hide them for some time in a closed place that almost no one knows about. Amelia had read the novel and knew that the source of the plague was magical, and her uncle had told her that the refuge had been abandoned for a long time, so it should be clean and safe. The maid understood that her uncle wanted to save the heirs of the family, and his idea seemed quite logical and reasonable, but she still felt uneasy at the thought that they were locked up and could not go outside. Benja exchanged a long look with the girl and thought about how his whole life had changed in just one night. He then asked Jerome if this meant that they would now spend all their time locked within these four walls where there weren't even any windows. And when her uncle answered in the affirmative, Estelle screamed in fear because she more than anyone else wanted to get out as quickly as possible. Ivar replied that he did not know any other ways to better protect his loved ones from the impending danger, especially since he expected that the confinement would not last long. Suddenly, Sir Jerome grabbed his head and said in a breaking voice that he could not bear the thought of losing his nephews as well. Letias and Benja looked at their uncle in surprise, who was always a calm and confident man, and while the young Viscount was struggling to come to his senses and drive away bad thoughts, the boys asked how long they would be forced to tolerate each other and sleep so close. Finally, the uncle was able to pull himself together and replied that their forced confinement, according to his plan, would last about 1 week, so that they could still be sent by ship to another country. The first son asked how things would go with their daily life, for example, with meals since they were already hungry. Ivar replied that they should not worry about that, because the chamberlain would help them with everything, and it was time for him to leave. Leaving the stone walls of the shelter, the uncle strictly warned the children that for them to leave this refuge would mean risking the existence of the entire glorious Serpente family. Before leaving, the uncle paused a little and said that he understood how difficult it would be for them to pass this test. But he believed that they would cope, and then the aristocrat turned to Amelia. The man reminded the maid that her main duty was to take care of Lady Estelle, and the girl assured the master that she would make every effort to ease the lot of the little mistress. Ivar then added that he hoped for the prudence and patience of the young heirs, and also reported that the chamberlain with food supplies would arrive soon after his departure. The children then accompanied their uncle to the mirror door and learned that he would not visit them for at least a week. The door did not remain closed for long. After only a few minutes, it opened again. A tall, unfamiliar man in a servant's uniform appeared on the threshold and introduced himself to the surprised Latias as a new chamberlain named Harris. Then the first son asked why he had come, and not his former servant Karen, to which he received an unexpected answer that he no longer worked on the estate. Amelia looked at the boy and wondered what he would become when he grew up, because she already knew the answer. But she always wondered for what reason exactly do people become who they are. The book said that after returning from a trip abroad, Ledius received the title of Duke, and then together with his brother, organized a criminal community, and Estelle did not survive the trip. Meanwhile, the new chamberlain told the boy that his predecessor had died that morning, struck down by the plague, and so he would be taking over his duties. Then the man added that in order to reduce all risks to a minimum, he would be the only one of the servants who would communicate with the young heirs. In addition, the chamberlain repeated Viscount Jerome's instructions that they should under no circumstances attempt to escape from the shelter on their own, for their own safety. After all, Harris turned to Amelia and said that she had a great responsibility not only to look after Milady Estelle, but also to serve the young gentleman. Then the chamberlain began to tell her about her new duties about the daily routine, and that the food he would bring should be served strictly according to schedule, and so on. Realizing that difficult times awaited her, the girl asked if she had understood her new colleague correctly, that he would come to them only once a day. Harris answered in the affirmative, and added that she herself understands that the less often people visit them, the lower the likelihood of bringing infection. And before the man finally left the room, the girl managed to ask what they should do when the food ran out. The chamberlain hastened to reassure Amelia, saying that she should leave the empty grocery cart outside the door, and that when they went to bed, he would replace it with a new one full of supplies. The man then walked out and closed the mirrored surface behind him, leaving the children and the maid to ponder their new situation. Touching the smooth surface with her hand, the nanny's daughter began to think, and came to the conclusion that most likely the door only opens from the outside. And while the girl stood there and thought, various bad thoughts visited her, because anything could happen to them here. For example, her ward, Lady Estelle, could get sick. After the death of the head of the family and his wife, Amelia was seriously worried about the physical condition of their daughter, since the child turned out to be quite sickly. According to the story described in the novel, it was the endless illnesses that led the unfortunate Estelle to the grave. And that trip abroad, which they still had to go on, was the last straw that finally undermined the girl's health. Remembering this, Amelia began to cry. Soon the second brother came up and asked why the girl was standing in front of the door. She knows how dangerous it is outside. Instead of answering, the maid asked her own question and asked if Beignet thought the whole situation looked strange. The boy came closer and asked again what she meant, and what exactly was bothering the girl. And then the second son added that all this certainly seemed like excessive concern, but he could understand his relatives, because the situation with the plague was really serious. Amelia thought that everything seemed logical, but doubt settled in her soul because her intuition told her that something was wrong with this story. The girl continued to stand at the mirror. A strange feeling did not leave her, because she seemed to know the ending of the whole novel. But how exactly the heroes should come to it remained a mystery. And while the nanny's daughter was thinking about how she should pull herself together and come up with a plan of action, Estelle suddenly ran up from behind and rushed to hug her. The little girl looked at her maid with a pitiful look and said that she was very hungry and was surprised that Amelia herself did not feel hungry. Then the girl decided that she absolutely had to figure out this situation, but it was hard to think about anything on an empty stomach, so she began to serve the prepared dishes to the table. There was quite a lot of food, and it was quite fresh and attractive, so in this regard, all worries disappeared without a trace. Soon the maid set the table and invited the heirs of Serpente to the meal. As Benja walked to take his seat, he passed by Estelle and said that now he hoped that no one would complain about the food. However, the second son did not address his sister, but his firstborn Latias, who noted that these difficulties were temporary, so he could wait these few days until they returned. And while the brothers were taking their seats in the spacious dining room, they began to quarrel over trifles, blaming each other. Amelia headed towards the door to close the door to the room, and as she held the door handle, she thought that boys had a very difficult and quarrelsome character. Suddenly, Litias literally screamed with indignation. He began to shout that eating pancakes without sauce was outrageous. The nanny's daughter immediately returned to the table and politely asked to pay attention to the bottle standing behind the first son. The boy's face immediately changed, and he turned red. And then he heard Benja ask his brother to pass him some sauce to pour over his food. Amelia reached out to pass the bottle from one brother to the other, but Latias insisted on doing it himself. But instead of sharing the contents, the first son began to pour generously onto his own plate. Benja took this as impudence, immediately jumped up from his seat, and ran to his brother to take the sauce from him, but he refused and declared that by right of the firstborn, he should receive the best in abundance. A verbal altercation between the heirs escalated into a physical altercation, as a result of which they poured syrup not on the pancakes, but on the table and the surrounding objects. Suddenly, there was a sharp and dull blow of a fist on the table, which immediately brought everyone to their senses and forced them to stop their useless fuss. It was little Estelle. She was angry because she had not eaten for so long, and now her relatives were interfering with her long-awaited meal. The girl then added that the brothers should stop fighting immediately and focus on breakfast. After thinking for a moment, the children silently went to their places so that the young lady found herself at the head of the table. Amelia was glad about this turn of events because her ward showed restraint and did not burst into tears as she had before, but was able to calm her brothers. For a while, there was complete silence in the dining room, except for the rhythmic clink of cutlery and the crunch of chewed vegetables. But then it was time for dialogue. Letius began to talk about how he was already 15 years old, but he still hadn't heard anything about this place and was surprised how such a thing was even possible on the estate's territory. Benja agreed with his brother because he was sure that the first son should have been informed by now about all the important details of their family mansion. The firstborn passed the plates from the table and remarked that he really didn't know something and that he probably still had a lot of unknown things to discover. The boy suddenly remembered the words his father had told him before his death, that Latias was the heir of Serpente and had to learn a lot to lead his illustrious family. Benja didn't answer. He just stood there and silently looked at the dishes that the children had put back on the table for eating. The boy remembered his parents, who died so suddenly, but they were so strong and healthy. The girls listened and said nothing. They too were full of memories and worries about the dead. Estelle said with pain in her voice that she really missed her father, whom she missed so much. Amelia walked up to the little girl and hugged her, and she continued to talk about how hard it was for her to live without her mom and dad. And she also remembered Sylvia, her former nanny, who had also died. The girls hugged each other and began to go over in their heads the memories of the days gone forever, where they were with their parents. After some time, one of the brothers came down the steps and headed straight towards the maid. The boy asked where his sister was now, and received the answer that she was trying to regain her strength and at least get some sleep. Soon the second son arrived, and then they discussed the condition of Estelle, who was very emotional and had difficulty getting used to new living conditions, especially finding it difficult to sleep in a strange place. When the girl was finally able to fall asleep, the three of them went to the dining room, where Benja suggested that they explore the place where they had suddenly found themselves. Amelia asked again what exactly they wanted to know about this room, and why. The second son replied that the last time they went on reconnaissance, they were stopped by a mirror, and now he plans to continue searching for something interesting because they haven't seen everything here yet. The boy added that it seemed to him that there was some large room further on where there might be something useful, and the maid asked why they needed it if they would soon leave the shelter. Amelia listened as Benja insisted that if they left soon, they would definitely not be able to find out anything new about this place until they returned, and when that would be was unknown. The children began to discuss options for what purpose this place was built in the first place, and therefore began to look more closely at the objects around them. The bedroom, dining room, kitchen, bathroom, and other rooms were all too modest for aristocrats and too large for household servants, who usually huddled in small rooms. Letias said he wanted to go with them, but suggested that they arm themselves with some kind of light source, a lamp or a candle, because it was very dark and damp further on. Soon the lamps were found, and the firstborn lit their wicks with a burning candle. Now the three-man company was ready for new adventures, and they set out towards the unknown, inspired by the passion for exploring unknown spaces. The room on the ground floor was much larger than expected, with a high ceiling and rather elegant wood paneling, although there were a lot of cobwebs and dust everywhere. Benja couldn't help but let out a cry of delight when they walked a little further and discovered a huge bookcase tightly packed with various books. And there wasn't just one closet there, the shelves were simply enormous from floor to ceiling, which caused extreme surprise, because it was a shelter, not a library. Suddenly, Letius heard a strange rustling sound and raised his head high up. The boy screamed loudly at what he saw, which frightened Amelia so much that she shuddered violently, and a chill of fear ran down her spine. The girl turned around and asked him to stop scaring her, but Letias pointed his finger up and added that she should definitely look in that direction. High up right under the ceiling, there was a window. It was covered with opaque curtains that swayed in the light breeze. It was surprising to find any source of external light in such a place, so everyone gathered looked closely at the find. Amelia suggested that if they could somehow get to it, they would see more precisely where they were. This idea definitely pleased everyone, because real daylight was coming from the opening, which meant that the clue to where the shelter was located could be solved right here and now. Moreover, standing in front of the window, the children could now clearly see what the weather was like outside, as the light clouds and blue sky were quite noticeable. After a brief search for something to climb on, Amelia was able to find a ladder that was leaning against one of the bookcases. The brothers quickly dragged the find to the wall and positioned the edge so that it practically rested against the window frame, which was quite enough to implement the intended plan. But when Benja took it up, he noticed that the structure was very old and dilapidated, and therefore looked extremely unreliable, so Amelia suggested continuing the search. Serpente's heirs tried to find another item that would suit their purposes, but nothing similar was found. Then Letias looked closely at the maid and noticed that her weight was the minimum, so if the ladder could support anyone, it would be her. Benja and the nanny's daughter looked at the firstborn with disappointed eyes, and then the second son noticed that the first simply did not want to risk himself and suggested that the maid do it out of cowardice. Hearing such accusations, the boy became furious and shouted that they did not understand anything, and now he would explain everything to them since they were so stupid. Letias noted that he and Benya would stay below, and then if something happened and the crossbar broke, they would be able to easily catch the falling girl. But if he climbs on his own and falls, then his younger brother and the maid simply won't be able to stop his fall because he's big and heavy. Moreover, the firstborn was sure that they wouldn't catch him. Then the second son asked if Letias would catch him if he climbed himself, and the boy replied that no, and he would never insure his younger brother. Amelia listened as Benja accused his relative of being a bad older brother, to which Letias retorted that he became that way because the younger one did not respect him. At some point, the girl decided to stop their quarrel, quickly stood between them, and took their hands by the shoulders, suggesting that they immediately stop the conflict and think again about the situation. The maid said that, in fact, it was not at all necessary to climb the old ladder to the window and take risks. This act might not be worth the effort and health invested in it. But the brothers unanimously rejected this proposal and expressed themselves in the spirit that they should definitely find out where exactly they were, because this could be very useful and important. Amelia replied that she, of course, would be interested to know this too, but she could just wait until Uncle Jerome came and ask him it would be easier and safer. The children looked at each other and did not answer, but only tried to look away. Benja noticed that there was some common sense in her words, and perhaps she was indeed right in the current situation. For a while, the heirs of Serpente and the maid stood near the bookcase, thinking about their next steps. Amelia found it strange that the children became so quickly embarrassed and silent from her question, and Latias, for some unknown reason, persistently hid his eyes. Benja also behaved unnaturally. Perhaps they knew or suspected something, but did not want to talk about it. Perhaps they themselves were tormented by bad feelings about this place. The maid thought for a moment about what her mother would do if she found herself in a similar situation, and the answer came quickly enough. The girl approached the stairs and grabbed the railing, thus deciding to defuse the situation, which was becoming less and less comfortable with each passing minute. Bar after bar, Amelia began to climb up. She did not think about the fact that Latias promised to catch her, but only about the fact that she served the Serpente family and must do it well. Having almost reached the window, the girl raised her left hand to push aside the swaying curtain. But when she did this, the slightly open window sash immediately began to swing open quickly, and the maid was hit by a sharp gust of strong wind. However, Amelia stayed on the ladder, unlike the wooden panel itself, which had rotted in places due to old age, and simply fell off, and then flew down onto Benja. The boy barely managed to jump aside when he heard the nanny shout that he should be careful, and soon after that, the piece of wood fell to the floor and split into pieces. The second son looked at the girl and accused her of doing it on purpose. Amelia apologized and added that everything here was so ancient and dilapidated that it would crumble at the slightest touch. Finally, the girl turned around, went up another step, and looked out the window, where a beautiful and serene picture opened up before her. The view was certainly attractive, but completely uninformative, since apart from the sky and distant mountains covered with green forest, nothing was visible. The brothers standing below began to question the maid about what had opened up to her gaze, but she could not answer them at all. Amelia even leaned out of the window, trying to see at least something in front of her, but there was nothing concrete there. An inspection of the outside of the building also revealed nothing, just a smooth stone wall, and that's all. Suddenly, the girl discovered something she never expected to see, and it made her eyes widen. At the top, directly above it, there was a huge bell. It was attached to a mechanism that vibrated and struck at the right moment. Suddenly, the maid heard a warning cry from the window where the brothers were standing below. The crossbar she was leaning her foot on began to crack and broke right in the center. Amelia felt that nothing was holding her back at this considerable height any longer, and the next moment she was flying down. Benja raised his hands up to catch the falling maid, while Latias remained standing there confused. The teenagers watched spellbound as the nanny's daughter flew until she fell right on top of one of them. Benja was the closest, so the blow fell right on him. After the fall, cushioned by her younger brother, Amelia sat up and began to rub the bruises. Her head hurt, but she managed to avoid serious injuries. Latias came up from behind, guiltily making excuses, saying that he had no idea that the ladder would be such a weak structure. The nanny's daughter turned around and reproachfully noted that he had promised to catch her if anything went wrong. And then the maid added that the second son probably received serious injuries because he tried to catch her alone. The girl leaned over to the guy and began asking how he felt, to which Benja replied that she should first get off him because she was pressing on him with the weight of her own body. Amelia came to her senses and released her savior and repeated the question, to which the boy replied that he had not thought that she would be so heavy. The maid felt a little awkward about being in this situation, but she was glad that everything turned out quite well and no one was hurt. Then Latias came up and gave the girl his hand to help her stand up. He began to ask what exactly she managed to see from the window. The nanny's daughter told about seeing a bell on the chapel, which is located on their estate. The brothers were very surprised, because they never expected that there could be such an unusual place as a secret shelter inside the bell tower. Amelia thought that the heirs of Serpente knew about this place, but it turned out that it was as much of a surprise to them as it was to her. The boys came to the conclusion that they knew much less about their own estate than they had previously thought. The maid also added that she knew nothing about this place, which meant that this information was kept secret from her mother as well. Lydia said that when it was noon, the bell would definitely ring. Therefore, they would know about this place without all these risks. Amelia noted that if the sound was too loud, Estelle would probably wake up and be scared. The maid thought that her charge was afraid not only of loud noises, but also of heights, and therefore would be horrified when she found out that they were at the very top of the tower, although it was indeed safe there. It turns out that the room where they ended up is in plain sight, which means no one will look for them here. The bell tower is always in front of your eyes. Everyone has long been accustomed to it, and it would never occur to anyone that a secret shelter is located here. Even if the children try to make noise, no one will hear them, because the building is located far from the main buildings, and there is always a strong wind up there, so the mirror is their only door. If you try to get out through the window, there is a sheer wall there, and you can easily fall to your death. If someone decides to leave them there forever, it will be almost impossible to prevent this. This series of bad thoughts quickly flew through Amelia's head, although she did not want to think about it, but she could not get rid of the bad feeling. Benja noticed that the maid was thinking hard about something, and that these thoughts were making her uneasy. But when he asked her, she did not answer, but only said that everything was fine. Then the nanny's daughter said that she should go back and check on her charge Estelle, because she was worried about her. Meanwhile, the wind from the street freely burst through the open window and fluttered the light curtain. In the room of the young heiress of Serpente, there was a table with a dressing table, a jug of water, and a small bowl for washing. Amelia picked up a comb and offered the little lady to tidy up her hair. And while the maid was combing her blue hair, she asked how her charge had slept and whether anything had bothered her, to which the girl replied that everything was fine, only the air was very heavy. Estelle also shared her desire to open the window in her room as soon as possible, although there are no windows there, and complained about the bell being too noisy, which frightens her and prevents her from resting. The nanny's daughter completely agreed with the girl, and she also thought that she never even imagined that she would ever find herself in such a situation. The situation was slightly brightened by the fact that Amelia could now freely wear the clothes of the heiress of Serpentes. They brought a lot of clothes for the young lady, but no one bothered to give the maid any kind of uniform. When the nanny's daughter told her young mistress about this problem, she immediately stated that the girl could wear things from her personal wardrobe. Amelia also noticed that Estelle really liked this idea, because now she could dress up the maid like a doll as she wished, which certainly improved her mood. The girl was pleased that at least in this way she could amuse the little lady. Then the nanny's daughter remembered Viscount Ivar's promise that the new chamberlain would bring them everything they needed. However, in reality, their supplies were simply being replenished while they slept. The cart was filled with food, and there was no more communication with Harris or Uncle Jerome. So, in agonizing anticipation of the promised freedom, a whole week passed, and on the morning of the 6th day, Amelia, as before, combed her ward's hair. The maid finished tidying up Estelle's hair and asked if her mistress liked her work. The little girl turned around and replied that everything was fine, and the nanny's daughter caught herself thinking that during these days, no one from the outside world had even asked how they were doing. But something could have happened. Despite the fact that the food was fresh every day, it should be noted that the diet was quite monotonous. Estelle was the first to notice this, and also noticed that their dishes do not change at all every day, the same set. In addition, they are always cold, which makes them tasteless. Latia smiled and noted that there was only one more day to wait, and then asked what the sister and brother would like to eat first when they finally got out of here. Estelle picked up her fork and declared that what she wanted most was cheese. She missed it so much that she was ready to personally destroy all the cheese supplies in the estate. Benja replied that he was missing fish dishes and veal, and when he left here, the first thing he would do was run to the kitchen, beat the cook, and then satisfy his hunger. Suddenly, the heirs all looked at Amelia and asked her what she thought about this. The girl thought for a long time, so much so that she left the fork sticking out of her mouth and finally suggested that she would probably like a cream pie, and Latias immediately added that he knew this in advance. The firstborn looked cheerfully towards the pantry and reminded that when he was very little, he often gave his desserts to the nanny's daughter. And when his mother, the Duchess, found out, she got angry. Benja recalled that episode from her childhood and added that Amelia didn't find it so funny at the time, because the girl was accused of deliberately begging the gentleman for treats. Then the boy smiled and remarked that now he finally understood why their maid had become so heavy. That's how she had gained weight. The girl looked angrily at her second son and thought that she should have fallen on him harder for such unpleasant words, and Latias asked his brother to be more polite. In response, the second son snapped at the firstborn and said that he did not see anything offensive in his words, because one cannot be offended by the truth. But the eldest heir interrupted him and said that when you say something, you need to think about others, and now everyone's mood at the table during the meal was spoiled because of him. The younger brother raised his finger and replied that everything was quite the opposite, and that the instigator of any quarrel was always his older relative, and then he became rude. Latias instantly became angry and asked Benja to immediately repeat what he had just said. Estelle, seeing that things were taking a serious turn, hastened to take refuge in Amelia's arms, and the maid loudly demanded that the heirs calm down and stop arguing. Then the maid added that their quarrel had frightened the little girl, who would now take a long time to calm down. This news cooled their ardor a little and brought the children to their senses, so they fell silent and got up from the table looking at their sister. Benja said that he agreed with this argument and was willing to calm down for the sake of Estelle's mental well-being. The boy then added that this did not mean at all that he admitted that Latias was right, and therefore he considered it necessary to simply leave the dining room, which the boy did, slamming the door behind him. The firstborn began to shout after him that their conversation was not over, and that he perceived such an escape as the younger brother admitting his own guilt. Amelia approached the teenager, took his hand, and said that he was also to blame for the fact that Estelle was constantly nervous and did not sleep well since any quarrels between the brothers traumatized her very much. The boy walked away from the maid and replied that for the sake of his sister's well-being, he was ready to turn a blind eye to some of Benja's antics. The nanny's daughter was glad that she had managed to resolve the quarrel, but she was worried that the brothers were constantly arguing and could not find a common language, which sometimes became dangerous. The girl began to clear away the dishes, put the cutlery in its place, and think about what caused their feud, because in a few years they would become real evil bandits. For the rest of the day in the tower, the brothers tried to keep their distance from each other, and Estelle spent it in the company of Amelia, which at least somehow raised her spirits. When evening came, everyone went to bed waiting for tomorrow, for there were so many hopes for it. Finally, morning came. The maid woke up and began to straighten her hair, which was scattered across the pillow. Suddenly, the girl remembered that today was the last day of their forced confinement, and her eyes opened wide. The maid got up first. Estelle continued to sleep peacefully on the bed, where they had gone to bed in the evening. Then Amelia thought that she had woken up too early, and that it was still a long time until morning, so she lit a candle and quickly washed her face. She didn't feel like sleeping at all, as the girl was very worried about their imminent release, so she decided to take a walk. The nanny's daughter came downstairs and saw the cart in its old place. It was always left near the mirrored door. With a familiar movement, the maid lifted the dome over the plate of food and looked at the contents. There were pancakes with a melted piece of butter, exactly the same dish as all the days before. Amelia thought, because this day was supposed to be special, but it starts exactly the same as all the previous ones. The maid thought that Viscount Ivar could not deceive them, because they were his family and close people, so why did nothing change? Then the maid began to bite her nails, trying to calm herself down, and thought that she should wait because it was still deep night, and they could be let out during the day, or even in the evening. Amelia supposed that something might have changed in the outside world, but then why hadn't they been told about it, instead of just silently putting the cart full of food back in place? Suddenly, the girl's heavy thoughts were interrupted by Benja. He quietly came up from behind, took her by the shoulders, and asked what she was doing there, which scared the maid to death. The nanny's frightened daughter turned around and looked intently at the young gentleman, and he asked with an imperturbable look why she was so afraid of him. The second son calmly repeated his question about what happened and why she was walking around the floors so late at night. Amelia knew his bad character very well, and therefore decided to avoid conflict, smiled and noticed that he got up very early. But Benja continued to insist on his own, and pointing his finger at the girl, said again that he wanted to know why she was here. The maid did not resist, and told the truth that she was very interested in what would happen on the seventh day, because Sir Jerome promised that their stay here would not last longer than a week. However, the boy interrupted her and noticed that nothing had changed, because the cart as usual was in its place. Looking into his eyes, Amelia realized that the heir of Serpente was very upset and depressed. Apparently, he also expected good news from this day. The maid thought that the boy might suspect her of knowing something, or simply think that she did not trust his uncle, so she got up earlier than the others to be the first to hear the news. Benja added that he hopes that his relatives will come to them today as they promised, but later because waking up the children so early and bringing them home is stupid. Then Amelia reached out and pointed to the cart, noticing that it contained their usual daily rations for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The boy understood that giving out food in the evening, if they were planning to let them out of here during the day, was illogical and strange. However, the boy tried to stand up for his uncle, suggesting that the extra food could have been put in just in case. What if they were late in arriving? The maid noted that she was very concerned about the fact that there was no dialogue between them and the outside world, absolute silence, and only food supplies, no news or discussions. Amelia looked at her second son and added that not only was she in complete uncertainty, but also the heirs of the glorious Serpente family were in the dark about their future fate. Benyu was starting to get annoyed with this dialogue because he couldn't respond convincingly to the comments, so he asked the girl what she was getting at and what she really wanted to say. The maid did not want to quarrel with the boy, but she had long been tormented by various questions and suspicions about their fate, which Sir Ever had prepared for them. The nanny's daughter did not want to voice her thoughts out loud because she assumed the worst possible outcome, namely that the Serpente relatives decided to get rid of the direct heirs of the Duke and Duchess in order to appropriate their entire enormous fortune. Amelia thought that if she voiced her suspicions, her second son's reaction might be unpredictable. Unknown amount of time in this man's family, so she should think about every word she said. The maid remembered that, according to the plot of the novel, she managed to settle down well in the Serpente family. However, she was in the heroine's place and was not that same Amelia, so she could change the plot. Since the girl's fate depended entirely on these people, she had to be extremely careful and delicate in her actions. In this new world, she has her whole life ahead of her, and to spend her time with dignity and happiness, she must create a good reputation for herself and make influential friends. The heirs will face many difficulties and terrible shocks on their way, and the maid can try to make their lives better. But to do this, she must maintain good relations. And while Amelia was thinking about serious things and what she should answer the young master, she did not notice how Benya slowly raised his hand to her face. And then he flicked her finger hard, right in the forehead, which caused a lot of negative emotions and annoyance. The nanny's daughter asked why the guy did this because it was painful and humiliating. But Benja laughed and replied that when she was asked, she should immediately answer the question and not withdraw into herself, and then suggested that the girl felt hostility towards their new chamberlain. Amelia was very happy when she realized that the boy himself unexpectedly helped her get out of this situation with minimal risk, and besides, his mood improved. After this, the second son grabbed his stomach and complained that he was very hungry. Then the maid asked him why he had abandoned dinner yesterday and run to the library. Looking at the cart, Benja hesitated, and then replied that he wanted to show her his find. And when the girl asked what he found there, instead of answering, the boy grabbed her hand and dragged her along with him. The boy smiled slyly and added that it was better not to talk about this out loud because it needed to be seen with one's own eyes. Entering the library, they began to make their way between the shelves of books and soon stopped. Amelia, holding the candlestick in her hand, was shocked by what she saw, because she could not even imagine that the young aristocrat was capable of such a thing. There were a lot of ladders lying on the floor, both broken and whole. Benja boasted that he had gone through each of them and checked which ones were still strong and which ones were dilapidated. The maid was very surprised and began to reproach the boy for engaging in a risky business that people of his position should not engage in. And then the teenager, full of pride at the impression he had made on the girl, climbed up the ladder, leaning against the window, and added that he had been careful and everything had turned out all right. And that was the main thing. Once at the very top, the boy sat down on the windowsill and called Amelia up. He said that she should definitely take a look at it. However, the nanny's daughter began to protest and insist that he should come down immediately because sitting on the edge of the window was extremely dangerous. But Benja replied that he would only go down if she herself came up to him. The maid walked up to the ladder and grabbed the rung. This structure actually looked sturdier than the one she had climbed up a few days ago. As Amelia climbed up, the thought flashed through her mind that she could let the boy fall from the tower, and then a bunch of problems would disappear by themselves. But was that the price she wanted to change the plot? When she reached the very last crossbar, the girl stopped and looked above her and was shocked by what she saw. Her eyes widened in horror, and the boy's name was on the tip of her tongue for the reason that he wasn't there. The wind blew freely through the open window and swayed the light curtains. Amelia became scared because she had to look after not only Estelle, but also her brothers as a servant and as the eldest. The maid reached out her hand to the window to climb higher and confirm or deny her most difficult assumptions. And when the girl leaned over the edge and looked down, she was met by a hand and Benja's cry that she should follow him further. The boy added that it was safe here, she could lean on his arm and go down lower. Amelia was glad that Serpente's heir was alive, but his outrageous behavior made her very nervous. And when the nanny's daughter began to think about going down, she was overcome by a strong fear, because they were very high up and any careless movement threatened imminent death. The maid tried to resist and said that she was afraid to go so far, because she was very scared. But Benja was very confident. He stood firmly on his feet, and with a smile on his face, called the girl to join him, assuring her that everything would be fine. However, the fear was really strong, and overcoming it turned out to be a difficult task. Finally, Amelia made up her mind and let go of the wooden frame that she had been holding tightly with her hand all this time. The maid sat on the window frame with virtually no support, and her legs dangled out of the window. The boy took hold of the edge of the statue with one hand and extended the other to her, showing her the place where she should go down. The maid was very scared, but she was able to overcome this feeling, although she thought to herself that if she crashed, she would become a ghost and would haunt the naughty boy until the end of her days. Finally, she closed her eyes and, trusting the young heir of Serpente, took a step into the void. Having flown only a short distance, the maid landed softly, leaning on the boy's strong arm. Benja praised the girl for her courage and suggested that she had once climbed the statues with other children. Despite the very flattering review, Amelia felt unwell. She still could not believe that she had agreed to this adventure and given in to a childish prank. The back of the stone gargoyle was wide and slightly sloped, so there was enough room to sit on it without fear of falling down. When the girl got comfortable, she said that she would never come down here again, and then asked why Benja had called her here. But instead of answering, the boy pointed to the horizon where the sun was rising. Serpente's heir noted that the sunsets here were slightly better than the sunrises, but both natural phenomena were worthy of attention from this height. Then the second son added that it is much easier to think in the fresh air, and in their situation there is something to think about. Sitting on the shoulders of the stone statue, Amelia looked at the boy and asked what he was thinking about. In response, the girl heard that the young gentleman was going over the images of his deceased parents in his head and thinking about the future fate of his brother and sister during this strange time. The maid asked how Benja was feeling, and the boy replied that he was very glad that she was okay. The maid's daughter was surprised and happy at the same time. She was pleased that the heir of Serpente was worried about her, but she didn't think that he would talk about it so directly. The second son was silent for a moment, apparently collecting his thoughts, and then continued. Benja said that her role in Estelle's life is huge, and the brothers would never have been able to give their sister that level of care. Besides, their conflict with Latias would have escalated long ago if not for Amelia. The maid listened attentively to the young master and agreed with every word he said. She recalled that the Serpente children had always had a rather strained relationship with the firstborn, and Estelle getting along a little, but the second son always kept to himself. If we talk about human qualities such as love, kindness, and affection, then Latias could sometimes show them, but Benja, as a rule, remained cold and cruel in any situation. And now, suddenly, this quarrelsome teenager with a difficult character is showing signs of an adequate and sensitive guy. Amelia tried to comfort the teenager and said that everything would be fine, and then suggested that they return to the room before the others woke up. As the young people were leaving the door leading to the library, they ran into Latias, who was very surprised to see the two of them and began to ask what they were doing there. The firstborn looked confused and pointed his finger at the boy and girl in bewilderment. Benja folded his arms across his chest and answered the question with a question. Why did the first son get up so early? Latias was not going to give up and began to insist on finding out what was going on while making a strange expression on his face, as if asking for help. The second son replied that he had been thinking a lot about their family these days and was sure that he should reconsider his life priorities, to which the firstborn noted that he had had similar thoughts. Looking at the open door to the library, the brothers were silent for a moment and then continued their dialogue. Benja said that there could be no use in Latias's thoughts, even if he agreed to pass on his title of heir to the family. The firstborn immediately became angry and added that if he passed the title to his second son, he would ruin the family. But the younger brother smiled and noted that he meant passing the title in favor of Amelia. These words made the girl feel unwell, because she did not want to stand between the brothers of the famous family, because then she would not have the slightest chance. Latias folded his arms across his chest, closed his eyes, and remarked that if a servant became the head of the Serpente clan, she could drive out all the children without a penny in their pockets. But Benya did not agree with him. The nanny's daughter watched this children's argument with interest, and she still could not understand where the line was drawn beyond which these sweet children turned into notorious villains. Amelia smiled and said that she was not worth such attention because they had more important things to do, for example, the liberation from the tower planned for today. All day the children waited for Uncle Jerome to visit, but evening came and nothing had changed. Moreover, the next 2 days were no different from the previous 7. During another breakfast, Estelle couldn't stand it any longer and threw her napkin on the table, saying that more than anything in the world she wanted to get out of here. Serpente's heiress reminded them that they were promised freedom in exactly 1 week, but more time had already passed, and everything remained the same. The brothers sat silently and picked at the monotonous food on their plates, while the girl continued her hysterics. She even went so far as to call everyone liars. Amelia tried to calm her charge, saying that her uncle remembered them and was probably making every possible effort to fulfill his promise as quickly as possible. However, the younger sister finally lost her self-control and declared that she refused to eat this disgusting and identical food, which constantly made her sick, and she no longer trusted the maid. Latias said that Estelle should pull herself together immediately because their relatives care about them, and who knows what is going on out there in the outside world, so they need to stay calm. Then, the firstborn reminded that his sister was a representative of an ancient noble family, and therefore she should be able to wait and be patient. Perhaps things had only gotten worse outside the tower. Amelia walked up to the girl and put her hand on her shoulder, then said that, although it had been almost 2 weeks, the food was still appearing steadily in the mornings, so they shouldn't worry. The maid thought that perhaps the time had come when she should stay overnight at the mirror door and talk to Harris. Perhaps he could tell her at least something about their future fate. Suddenly, the door to the dining room opened, and on the threshold appeared the one for whom the forced prisoners had been waiting for so long all these days. Estelle looked at this man on whom so much now depended with genuine surprise and hope. It was Viscount Ivar in person. Although he didn't look very healthy, his face was pale, his eyes were sad, and in every gesture there was anxiety and nervous tension. There was silence in the dining room as everyone looked at Jerome as he slowly walked over and sat at the head of the table. The man leaned on his hands and looked down, then apologized for taking so long to show up, and added that they had already realized that the original plan had changed. It was strange, but the longer Amelia looked at this influential man, the less she trusted every new word he uttered. Latias was the first to respond. He asked how their relatives were doing, and whether any of them had died during this time, to which Ivar replied that a group of doctors had arrived from the capital yesterday. Benja, in his usual manner, interrupted his relative and asked if he was going to pick them up from here today. Then the second son added that he did not care about the situation that had developed outside their shelter because they could not wait any longer and had to get out of there immediately. Then the boy added that Estelle's health was in danger under these conditions, and with each such word, Jerome felt worse and worse. Finally, Uncle Ivar quietly asked if the heirs of Serpente Really thought that their loved ones wanted to lock them up here with evil intent? The brothers didn't answer, but they were definitely thinking about it, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for them to hide it. The Viscount continued speaking, and Amelia hurried to hug Estelle, because the man told how one by one everyone who had been at the Duke and Duchess's funeral began to fall ill and die. Jerome added angrily that death overtook even those servants who simply carried the coffins and were just passing by the ceremony. Therefore, Ivar is very disappointed by such a display of impatience and lack of restraint, because they are here to save their lives and give the Serpente family hope for the future. Silence fell over the dining room again, the teenagers not knowing that things were so bad outside their shelter. Amelia noticed how Estelle was literally shaking with fear after such bad news from her uncle. The maid understood that the situation was very difficult, but remaining locked in a stuffy room while the heirs were constantly making scandals was not much easier. In addition, the entire burden, both physical and psychological, fell on the shoulders of one young maid, since there were simply no other servants here who would help resolve household issues. In addition, it was quite cramped for active and mobile children here, because the heirs of Serpente were accustomed to space and freedom, and here there were only tiny rooms and stone walls. As for the food, it was tasty only for the first couple of days, then it turned into monotonous torture, and everyone forced themselves to eat only by force of will. A separate issue concerned the water, which was always cold, literally icy, and increased the chances of catching a cold during regular hygiene procedures. There was practically no entertainment, because reading old books in a poorly understood language did not bring any pleasure, and there were no games at all. Amelia remembered all these hardships of the confined space and thought that domestic animals in the pen felt much the same. Suddenly, the maid caught Viscount Jerome's gaze on her. He looked at her somehow harshly without a smile. It was obvious that the man was angry. He turned to the nanny's daughter without even calling her by name, but simply called out rudely. Ivar indignantly noticed that the girl was not wearing her own clothes, but a dress that was intended for his niece, to which the frightened maid replied that she was not given a change of clothes. The Viscount thought for a moment, then admitted that it was his mistake, and then began to apologize to Estelle for this misunderstanding, after which he noted that the chamberlain would issue a uniform. Then Benja spoke up. He remembered Harris and said that he didn't like him at all, because he didn't communicate with them and wasn't interested in their life, but only changed the food in the cart while everyone was sleeping. The boy added that they have to eat the same cold food every day, which has a very negative effect on its taste and their morale. The second son noted that if this circumstance could not be changed, then at least its cause could be explained. And then the uncle began to talk about their difficult situation and problems in the capital. The Viscount placed his hands on the table and noted that as long as the plague raged in the city, they were forced to make do with what they had, but they were doing it all for the sake of the survival of the Serpente family. The man added that it is really difficult for all of them now, but they must be patient and strong for the future. The heirs stood silently and listened to the sad news from their uncle's lips. It was difficult for them to accept all of this, but it seemed they had no other choice. Amelia hugged Estelle and thought that she was still very lucky, because there behind the mirrored door a plague was raging, killing indiscriminately both nobles and commoners. But the girl also saw that hugs and moral support had only a temporary effect on her charge, and the girl was noticeably broken and depressed by such a life. Benja said that he understood everything, but would like to hear at least some approximate time frame for their release from this forced confinement. The second son added that knowing the deadlines would give them at least some kind of reference point, allow them to set a goal and stick to the intended time. Sir Jerome did not know what to answer to such a request. His face was covered in sweat, and he was very tense, but the boy added that if the Viscount did not name a time frame, they would stop believing him. It became so quiet in the dining room that it seemed that the participants in this difficult dialogue could hear each other's heartbeats. Finally, the uncle gave in and replied that he was counting on about another month. Benja scratched his chin thoughtfully and repeated the stated period, then added that it was a very long period of time. The man noted that even for an adult, such an ordeal would seem like torture, and for small children, it would be tantamount to hard labor, but he saw no other chance of salvation. The nanny's daughter continued to hug the little lady and think that they had very difficult days ahead of them. Uncle Ivor added that he would make sure that in a month they would all be able to go abroad by ship, and at the same time he would try to ensure that the illness did not affect their departure. Sir Jerome then asked the children if they had heard him well that they would have to hold out for another month under these conditions, and the heirs were silent for a long time at first, and then agreed. As the Viscount had promised, Harris had placed a set of maid's uniform next to the cart the following night, so Amelia immediately went to the mirror to change. The dress was modest, but she liked it, because now she was becoming not just the daughter of a nanny who helped her mother, but a full-fledged servant in the famous Serpente family. The girl enjoyed looking at herself in the mirror because the uniform created a kind of coziness and an atmosphere of aristocratic order in the room. However, Estelle was not happy because she really enjoyed dressing her personal maid in different dresses, and now Amelia would have to wear this boring dress every day. The girl lay on the bed, her head on the pillow, and remembered how fun it was to change the girls' outfits, and then asked permission to at least sometimes play with her in this way. The nanny's daughter noted that their life would now be more comfortable because they had brought and installed a real working stove where they could heat water. The little lady could not share Amelia's joy, but only turned away in annoyance. Estelle clutched the pillow and said in a sad voice that she was so bad here that even warm water wouldn't change anything. The maid looked at her charge with alarm and thought with doubt about how the girl would be able to endure a whole month in such conditions without games and entertainment, in complete inaction. As she walked down the steps dressed in her new uniform, Amelia thought that the worst thing for a teenager is idleness, which literally drives the young mind crazy. Therefore, the first thing to do was to find a room for active games, where you could let off steam and have fun, and the girl did this, examining a small area. In addition, the maid planned to solve the problem of accurately determining day and night, using a window because living in constant twilight, not understanding whether it is day or night, is difficult. The maid paused and considered using the library downstairs as a games room. Previously, they did not even consider this room as worthy of their attention, since it was very dirty and smelled bad. There were cobwebs hanging in the corners, and objects were covered in a thick layer of gray dust that had not been removed for decades. It is also strange that the bookcases, which were very large and tall, did not crumble from dampness under the weight of such a large number of books. While examining the premises and pondering how to turn this garbage dump into a decent playroom, Amelia was called out. It was Benja. He asked the girl what she was doing here and why she was looking at him so strangely. The nanny's daughter looked around the room and said that she planned to take care of this area so that it could be useful to them like the other rooms on the upper floors. The maid then added that she was worried about Estelle's morale and that if they made a gaming room here, then there would be one less problem. But Benja expressed doubts that this was possible. This reaction amused the girl, because before her was a man of noble blood who could not even think of getting his hands dirty with simple physical labor, cleaning up dirt. Benja yawned and added that the idea certainly looked good, but he couldn't even imagine how to implement such a volume of work. Amelia was ready to laugh at the nobleman's helplessness, but she held back and closed her eyes, reminding herself that she should be supporting the relationship, not destroying it. Latias soon joined the young people. He asked what they were planning, and the second son, pointing his finger at the maid, replied that she wanted to start a big cleaning in the library. The firstborn said that nothing would work because they had no servants, and his uncle would never allow people from the house to enter this area for some cleaning. But the maid objected to him. Amelia added that it was not so bad because they had one servant, and then the brothers rushed to her, vying with each other to ask who she had seen here besides Harris. The girl put her hand to her chest and noticed that she herself was a servant who could not only comb Estelle's hair, serve food, or help the heirs, but also do the cleaning. The boys were very surprised by this news because they had never thought about it, and then asked if the girl could really handle this colossal amount of work alone. Amelia smiled and noted that she was confident in the result if the heirs helped her, because they would have to live here for a long time, and no one could help them except themselves. Benja thought for a moment and began to muse out loud that having a spacious play area would make their confinement much more pleasant. But Latias folded his arms over his chest and frowned. The maid began to carefully examine the trash and junk scattered around her in the corners, and then said that she would now tell them where they would start cleaning. The first thing the girl considered necessary was to rid the library of the large amount of dust that had accumulated over the years on the shelves of cabinets and other surfaces. Looking at the tower with a single window, no one would think what a great deal of work was going on behind its walls. It took several long hours for two teenagers and a maid to finally get the room back to a normal habitable state. When they had finished, they simply fell to the floor from exhaustion because the maid had given it her all, and for the heirs, hard work was a novelty. Amelia looked at the work done and came to the conclusion that the little lady would really like this result. Soon on the threshold of the updated library, the one for whose sake all this was started appeared. All this time, while the young people were working tirelessly, Estelle slept peacefully in her bed. And when she woke up, she discovered that no one was around and went in search. The girl squatted down next to her maid and asked with interest what they were doing there, and Amelia replied that they were doing a little cleaning. Letius got up from the floor and sat up. He laughed and suggested that his sister find some smart book that would be useful for development, and then added that they dusted all the books. Benja added that there should be a place to rest here where one can lie down and take a nap after a hard day's work, and then clarified that it should definitely be near the window. Estelle walked carefully into the library and began to examine the clean room, while Amelia reminded her second son not to go too close to the window. The young people were very pleased with their hard work, because after cleaning, there was so much free space that you could even play hide and seek. Despite the general merriment, Estelle continued to stand and look around. She heard the joyful exclamations of her brothers and the maid, but she herself remained silent until now. Finally, something inside the girl changed, and her mood improved dramatically from the thought that now she would be able to have some fun, and the girl laughed loudly, anticipating fun games. The presence of a playroom had a positive effect on all the prisoners of the shelter. The days began to pass much more joyfully, and the sadness of not being able to go outside gradually began to diminish. The main games were hide and seek and tag, which were of course more suitable for younger children, but the children had not yet come up with other entertainment. Estelle's condition improved noticeably, but her bouts of hysteria and mood swings could not be completely eliminated, so the baby cried from time to time. Time moved very slowly. Each day seemed like an eternity, and Amelia needed a lot of effort to keep both herself and her charge in a normal state. In addition, the maid felt that there was absolute uncertainty ahead of them all, which constantly undermined and reduced any positive emotions. In the midst of all this, they had to endure the same food which Harris brought in on a cart every day, and so far there had been no slightest change in their diet, which was very annoying. The prisoners tried to write letters and notes to somehow communicate with the outside world, where they outlined their requests for food and other needs, but no one ever responded to them. On one of the walls, they even began to cut out marks to see how many days had passed and how many were left. For the teenagers, this confinement turned into an endless nightmare. However, all horrors come to an end, and the term of their imprisonment was also approaching its intended date. Amelia saw this clearly every time she looked at the wall with notes in the morning. On the day that marked a month since Viscount Jerome's last promise, the weather was fine. The sun was shining brightly, and there were almost no clouds in the sky. At the same time, the maid did not relax, but continued to calmly and disciplinedly perform her duties, for example, washing clothes. Having finished with another batch of linen, the girl stopped for a minute to catch her breath and rest a little. During this long time, Amelia learned a lot, and was even able to master washing large items such as bed linen and blankets using her own feet. The maid also grew stronger mentally because she was forced to be under constant stress, taking care of the little lady and smoothing out conflicts between the arrogant brothers. At the very beginning of this period, the maid made a decision for herself that she would perceive everything that happened here as an endless series of life lessons, which she would accept with gratitude. This position helped the girl to go through a lot of trials and endure with dignity many troubles and hardships that arose before her during this time. Amelia looked at Estelle's freshly laundered dresses and thought that she had succeeded in fulfilling her plan, and therefore her spirits were high. Her current level of skill as a maid was so high that she could wash a bright lace dress decorated with jewels clean without ruining anything. While wiping a large, beautiful stone, the maid thought that she was now so experienced that when they left here, no one would dare to replace her, and she would remain with the young mistress. These joyful thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a sharp call from behind, from which the girl shuddered violently and felt unwell. Benja approached as usual, unnoticed, and then abruptly asked the girl what she was doing, to which he received a completely logical answer: washing clothes, although this was already obvious from the many things around. Then the second son, who looked irritated and angry, asked why Amelia was doing this. Didn't she know what day it was? The maid felt awkward about being questioned like that, but she held back and replied that she was washing the clothes because they were dirty and that was her job. Serpente's heir frowned and added that he didn't remember her ever doing laundry here before. The girl was outraged because she tried so hard to learn something new and useful, and finally she succeeded, and then suddenly she was reproached for being too proactive. Amelia began to justify herself by saying that she wanted to clean up and make sure everything was clean, and then added that she, like the other inhabitants of the shelter, did not like dirt. But when the girl mentioned the fact that while they were here, order had to be maintained, Benja finally lost his temper. The teenager quickly walked up to her, grabbed her by the shoulders, and lifted her up sharply, preparing to tell her his thoughts on the matter. The second son literally screamed that she wanted to curry favor so that everyone would think that she was a good servant, but all she should really do is behave as before. The heir of Serpente squeezed the maid's shoulders tightly with his hands and added that her only duty, both within the walls of the shelter and beyond them, was to entertain the descendants of the noble family. Amelia was shocked by such a revelation and did not immediately find what to answer. So strongly did these words hurt her. The girl lowered her head and quietly said that she wanted to be not only a useful nanny, but also help with other household matters. Benja stopped frowning and looked closely at the maid, who now felt very bad. The boy hesitated for a moment, but then suddenly he realized something and his expression immediately changed. Then the young aristocrat quickly removed his hands from the fragile girl's shoulders and began to justify himself, saying that he did not mean this at all. But it was too late. Amelia lost self-control and began to cry quietly, and bad thoughts about her second son and his thoughtless actions were spinning in her head. Suddenly, Benja said that he was wrong and asked the girl for forgiveness. It was surprising because in all these years of communicating with him, she had never heard him apologize. The boy actually looked confused and acted like a person admitting his guilt, and then he added that he was sorry that it happened this way and offered his help. The maid was so surprised by this event that she immediately stopped crying and only continued to stand in front of the boy with her eyes wide open. It was surprising, but Benja didn't run away or freak out, but calmly picked up the brooch and started asking what he needed to do with it. Meanwhile, the day in the tower went on as usual, and outside the warm sun was still shining. The second son helped stretch a clothesline across the entire room in the library and began hanging bed linen to dry. Amelia praised the boy and continued to straighten the hanging dresses, thinking about how much this man had changed in recent times. Benja said that during their stay in the shelter, he did a lot of things that he could not have even thought of before, and for him, it was all a little strange. The maid agreed with the teenager and noted that he had been through a lot, but no one would believe him if he told her that he helped with cleaning and laundry. To this, the teenager responded that he would hardly want to share such stories with anyone, and he also expressed doubt that they would ever get out of here. Amelia thought for a moment, and then asked what happened to the guy that he came to her in such a bad mood. The young aristocrat hung another sheet on the clothesline and noticed that she knew the answer to her own question perfectly well. The girl objected that at any moment the door in the mirror could open, and they would come for them to finally take them out of here. But the guy looking at the underwear replied that this might not happen. Seeing how upset Amelia was, Benja clarified that they could be picked up tomorrow in a week or in a month. That is, it was unknown when. The maid asked whether the second son really believed that the blame for their imprisonment lay not with the plague epidemic, but with relatives who had planned something bad. The boy looked at the girl, but didn't answer, just grinned. And then the maid realized that all those fears that had tormented her since the first day of their imprisonment also filled the mind of the young master. The boy finished hanging out the laundry, turned around, and looked calmly at the girl. And there was a lot of sadness, longing, and pain in that look from the expectation of a possible negative development of events. After some time, the bell rang, and the sound spread throughout the area, letting people know the exact time. The brothers were sitting at a table in the library, each busy with something of their own. Benja was reading a book and drinking tea, while Letius was thinking hard and suffering from agonizing anticipation. The firstborn turned to his second son and noticed that it was already noon and no one had come up to them. Perhaps they were playing a joke on them? The younger brother coldly remarked that such a stupid joke could only have occurred to Letius, and that it deserved a good spanking. The elder brother was immediately outraged by such rude words and asked Benya why he valued him so low, constantly humiliated him, and did not respect him at all. The second son looked at his cup and replied that respect requires reasons, and he didn't have a single one yet. Suddenly, the firstborn turned to the girls who were at the next table and addressed Amelia, saying that he was ready to forgive her everything if she immediately confessed to everything. The maid tensed up and asked what she had done wrong to Letius. The first son clarified that he considered everything that was happening to be a pre-planned performance, in which the maid played a special role. Upon hearing these words, Benja noted that this would be unexpected. The girl was holding a stack of books at that moment, and most of all, she wanted to hit the air of Serpente with them for his words, for the fact that the boy still did not trust her, although she was suffering along with them. However, Amelia managed to restrain her outburst of feelings, and she thought about what kind of strange books he had read, since he began to look for deception and betrayal in everything. Suddenly, someone grabbed the maid by the clothes and pulled her towards him. She turned around and saw her charge. Estelle asked in a trembling voice if the girl was a witch like in the fairy tale she was reading now. For a moment, the maid felt like the whole world around her had gone crazy because she had tried so hard for them, endured hardships, and worked on herself every day. And in the end, she received distrust. And the most offensive thing for Amelia was that Estelle succumbed to this mass hysteria and also began to suspect her, although she had done so much for the little lady. After some time, Estelle tried to go to bed, but she couldn't fall asleep, and then the maid used a proven remedy. She began to sing a song about blooming lavender. It always helped. The girl ran her hand through the hair of the peacefully sleeping child and continued the lullaby in which the main character promised to become an empress if her chosen one became an emperor. The story in this nursery rhyme ended so well that even the birds and animals began to dance for joy, and by the end of the story, the little lady was fast asleep. Amelia thought about how she had tried various ways to calm the emotional girl before going to sleep, but the best method was the lullaby that her late mother sang to her. The nanny's daughter still remembered herself before she came here. Now she has changed to cope with new life situations. Also, for a deeper sleep and psychological peace, the maid made a new doll for Estelle with her own hands, similar to her previous toy, which the girl loved so much. This turned out to be very useful, since the baby usually had a hard time falling asleep, and with the rag toy the process of going to sleep became less painful. To create this craft, the maid used her old dress, so now she has also learned how to make dolls from fabric. The long-eared hare was named exactly the same as the one that remained in the Serpente mansion, namely Miss Wendy, and the girl liked her very much. The youngest daughter in the Serpente family was already 12 years old, which meant, according to all traditions, she had to move away from children's games and fun with dolls and try on the role of an adult girl. But how could Amelia force the young lady to grow up if she was barely holding on to the verge of a nervous breakdown? As she left the room, the maid turned around and looked at the peacefully sleeping girl, and then thought that they could degrade in this shelter because it was very difficult to develop here. The maid walked down the corridor in a clean dress. She was now doing laundry well, and often since almost 2 months had passed since Viscount Ivar's last visit. The girl remembered the novel she had read, as well as the part where the plague was described, and so around this time, the epidemic should have begun to recede, which meant that the outside world became safer. But no one came for them, and no news was passed, and all this indicated that the older relatives had their own plans for the inheritance. It was terrible to be completely dependent on people you didn't trust, so Amelia and the Serpente heirs tried their best to push bad thoughts away. The maid went out into the corridor and approached the cart. Everything was on it as usual: food, cutlery, and small items for household needs. they still had not managed to catch the process of replacing the dishes. The girl placed her hand on the cold metal surface and thought that the servants who changed the trays every night were probably aware of what was happening. The maid approached the door to the library and thought that if they tried to get out on their own, they might be punished and even deprived of food. Entering the room, Amelia looked at the window and came to the disturbing thought that the 2 years that the heirs allegedly spent abroad could well have been imprisonment in this refuge. The girl came to the conclusion that the most likely reason why they were locked up was an attempt to divide the Serpente family inheritance between distant and close relatives. The villains could kill them at any moment. Moreover, it is possible that those around them already thought that the children were dead, because the situation of a mass epidemic made it easy to hide various kinds of crimes. However, they were still alive, and Amelia, standing near the bookcase, wondered why her relatives had not gotten rid of them when they had such a convenient opportunity. Perhaps they were spared, because such a sudden death of so many heirs might arouse the suspicions of the emperor and the board of the Python Bank. Viscount Jerome said that his main task is to protect children at any cost, which means he can use this as an excuse to do whatever he wants. The maid began to bite her nails out of excitement and continued to think that this was a very cunning plan, because purely formally, the uncle really did to some extent protect them from the outside world. So even if we assume a situation where they manage to escape from the shelter and tell the emperor about what is happening, Ivar will always be able to justify himself by saying that he fed and cared for the heirs. These heavy thoughts of the girl were interrupted by Latias. The boy came up to her and stood next to her, but did not frighten her, as Benja usually did, but only quietly called her name. The first son pulled a book from the shelf with his finger and asked how his sister was feeling and whether she had finally managed to fall asleep. Amelia answered in the affirmative and said that the best sleeping pill for the girl was a lullaby sung by her mother, and then briefly recounted the content of the song. When she finished speaking, she noticed that the teenager was not listening to her at all, but was sitting and reading a book, as if she was not there at all. But then why did he ask if he was not interested in the answer? Benja answered, instead of Litias, saying that he himself would not refuse such a lullaby before going to bed, because in recent days he noticed that he could not fall asleep quickly. The girl turned to her second son and asked if he considered himself old enough to listen to lullabies before going to bed, but the boy objected that age meant nothing. The young aristocrat then invited Amelia to play chess with him and promised that if she won, he would treat her with more respect as an older and stronger person. The maid agreed to play by candlelight, but warned that if Estelle woke up, she would have to interrupt the game and go to her, so that she would not be scared. And Benja nodded understandingly. After some time, when the candle had completely melted and it was time to replace it, the maid stood up and went to the candlestick. The girl raised her hand to remove the stub and stood motionless for a while, thinking about something of her own. Benja called out to the maid impatiently and asked why she had stopped and was not doing anything she had planned. Amelia walked over to the bag where the candles were and said that she was worried about when they would run out of light sources because they were using up quite a lot, and no one was replenishing the supply. And while the second son was talking about how winter would soon come, the maid added that they still had lamp oil, which could also be used for lighting. Finally, the girl returned to the candlestick and replaced the burnt-out candle with a new one, and Benja asked her to sew a warm blanket because he saw how she made a ragdoll deer so she could make a blanket too. The new candle gave a lot of light, and the girl returned to the game. But before that, she noticed that the toy did not depict a deer, but a hare named Miss Wendy. And as for the blanket, they did not have fluff or wool. Amelia sat down opposite him, and the boy agreed that they really didn't have any animals here to shear, and then added that they had a lot of things to burn like books. The girl agreed that the library was indeed huge, and that in the most extreme case, they would have to use books as fuel, but she noted to herself that this option seemed wild. And while the maid looked at the game board and thought about her next move, Benja noticed that the books to be burned should be selected in advance, and in general, he did not know if there would be enough of them to survive the winter. The second son added that if their supplies were not replenished, then they should first take care of their sister and heat water, only for her. Ladias was silent all this time, listening and getting angry. Finally, the firstborn could not stand it any longer, and loudly slammed the book shut so that everyone fell silent and looked at him attentively. The main heir of the family literally shouted that he was tired of listening to this nonsense, so they must immediately stop this empty chatter. He then pointed his finger at Amelia and stated that he was very unhappy with her behavior and that what upset him most was her endless complaining and pessimism. The girl was clearly not prepared for such a display of anger from the young gentleman, and therefore froze in place, not knowing what to do. However, the weeks spent in the company of the heirs of Serpente were not in vain, and the maid quickly found something to answer, saying that she was trying to prepare for different scenarios. Lerias angrily stated that they shouldn't worry about something that didn't happen, but the girl tried to argue that they were in a difficult situation and they needed to be prepared for anything. The firstborn rudely interrupted Amelia and declared that she was just a servant who had forgotten her place and had again crossed the line of what was permitted and therefore should immediately shut up. Then the young aristocrat added that her behavior was simply outrageous and therefore she should immediately leave the library so as not to irritate him with her presence. The maid was very offended and humiliated to receive humiliation and insult as a reward for all her efforts. After a brief pause, Benja called out to his brother and waited until he turned his full attention to him. Then the second son suggested that Letias leave the room himself instead of the maid, because his whims were really annoying and constantly getting on his nerves. Hearing such words, the heir of Serpente became even more angry and asked his brother to repeat what he had said again. Seeing his firstborn approaching him, the boy stood up from the table and replied that of all the people in this shelter, only the first son regularly disturbed the peace, and therefore he should calm down. Benja continued noting that the older brother, even if he was in a bad mood, should not take it out on the maid. And after these words, Letias grabbed his second son by the collar of his shirt. Amelia didn't know what to do because a fight could start at any moment, so she simply screamed and began asking the gentleman to calm down and stop arguing. The girl did not want to allow a situation in which a fight would break out between the brothers, especially knowing that she had an indirect relation to it, so she began to beg them to calm down. The first son was a little confused by this pressure and apparently lost his determination to continue the fight. At the same time, Benya looked at his older brother with sincere hatred and contempt. It seemed that he was ready to start a fight at any moment at the level of assault. Amelia wanted to understand the reason for their endless conflicts and tried to talk to them about it, but both boys were silent and did not want to answer her question. How did it all start? Realizing that she had run into a dead end, the maid decided to leave the library, believing that, left alone, the teenagers would be able to talk and resolve the situation themselves. Finally, the girl noted that she was leaving because she wanted to avoid at any cost the continuation of the conflict that had begun. When the maid was left alone with herself, she stopped holding back and gave free rein to her feelings, after which bitter tears flowed from her eyes. Amelia stood and thought about how she had no idea what evil was hidden in Serpente's first son, because today the boy had shown his terrible nature as a cruel and merciless person. The girl walked down the stairs and thought about how in this world there is a division into classes where different sets of rights and responsibilities are given from birth, and it was painful for her to face this reality. The maid was haunted by the thought that she had crossed the line separating an aristocrat from a commoner. After all, they grew up from childhood and spent a lot of time together, while Amelia always tried to observe this invisible boundary, the violation of which Letias spoke about. The girl could not understand why her sincere concern and care were perceived as an attempt to allow herself more than she should. The maid poured a whole bowl of warm water on Estelle's back, but she had not experienced the joy of water treatments for a long time. The ward asked if they could postpone the bathing until another time, because the water was only slightly warm. However, Amelia objected that she needed to wash right now, because very soon the heated water would cool down and then become completely icy. Then the little girl looked pitifully at her maid and suggested postponing the procedures until the next day or sometime later, but the girl refused. Estelle added that they didn't have to take as much care of their appearance as before, because no one could see them, but the girl looked categorically at her charge and took shampoo from the shelf. Amelia noted that her lack of self-care and dirtiness, unacceptable for an aristocrat, would be immediately noticed by her brothers, and the heiress would feel much worse. The girl looked at Estelle and thought about the fact that laziness had killed more people in the world than all the epidemics, so she must maintain order and cleanliness in every possible way as an element of discipline. The maid understood that if she relaxed even for a moment and took a short break from externally maintaining her status, it could be a one-way trip, and not the most pleasant one at that. Finally, the maid managed to convince the little girl of the need for regular ablutions, and the girl agreed to bathe, and in the meantime, order and cleanliness reigned in the first son's room. The boy sat on the bed with his back to the door and thought about what was happening around them. In an unconscious attempt to aid his own thought process, the teenager began to bite the nail on his right thumb. Amelia opened the door and asked the boy if she could enter his room. The firstborn turned and looked at the maid silently, and she added that she had heated enough water for a bath and also planned to use the stove to heat food to improve their nutrition. The girl was very surprised to hear the boy's answer, who asked, "Why do they eat this monotonous food at all?" Amelia asked the young master again what he meant, and then the heir's eyes became very angry, and he added that only animals are fed the same food to fatten them up and send them to slaughter. There was silence in the room, which was broken by Benja, who entered the room and asked how the maid had managed to pass him by without being noticed. Then the second son smiled and added that now that they have warm water in the mornings, which Amelia regularly heats up, he feels much better. The maid greeted the gentleman and took the teapot in her hand to fill it with fresh water. Then Benja called his older brother to have breakfast, but he did not move from his place, but continued to sit on the bed and look in one direction. It all looked rather strange. After some time, the boy finally appeared at the table, and the children began to have breakfast. They started with a small bowl of soup. Nobody paid much attention to food, because after 2 months, everyone had become tired of it, so the children saved themselves by communicating with each other and by thoughts and dreams when there was nothing to talk about. Amelia was still worried about the fact that after the incident in the library, when Latius threw her out the door, she could not find a common language with him. He simply did not want to make contact. The heir of the Serpente family now constantly walked around sullen gloomy and spoke little. Unlike Benja, who continued to be himself, walking and talking, as if nothing had happened. The younger son looked at the girl and noted that they should pass on a note indicating that they were running low on lamp oil, and Amelia agreed to carry out this task. The maid added that the New Year holidays were coming soon, which meant that they should be prepared for in advance, to which Estelle objected that she did not want to celebrate any celebration here except liberation. The girl leaned over the table and said that she constantly felt like everyone had forgotten about them. Amelia hastened to reassure her charge, reminding her of regular food deliveries. Latias listened attentively to their dialogue, and an expression of interest even appeared on his face. The boy then put his fork down on the table and began to question the maid about why she mentioned Christmas and holidays. The boy frowned and expressed confidence that someone had told Amelia that they would be locked here until the New Year's celebration. The young gentleman's gaze became very intent and serious, and then he began to pry information from the girl about who she communicated with besides the heirs of Serpente. The maid realized that all this time the boy had been accumulating anger and resentment for that incident in the library, but she did not know how to get out of this situation. The heir's face was angry and cold. Anything could be expected from him now. The girl understood that she needed to do something immediately so that the situation would not escalate into a new scandal, so she suggested finishing the food while it was still hot and postponing the conversation for later. However, Latius had no intention of giving up. He raised his hand with the fork and pointed straight at the maid. The boy added that their previous conflict was still unresolved, and this time he would still be able to speak out, for example, about how the maid was telling his sister stupid things. This was a new accusation that once again touched Amelia to the quick, because she had done so much precisely for Estelle. So hearing reproaches about this was very offensive. The girl immediately rushed to stand up for her maid and said that her elder brother was not telling the truth, and everything that the maid was telling her were ordinary stories from fairy tales. And suddenly, Latius turned to his sister and began to accuse her of not wanting to grow up and continuing to follow the path of a naive child surrounded by primitive fairy tales and dolls. The teenager noticed that Estelle's whole life position was to hide behind a maid for any reason, and this was completely unworthy behavior for the heiress of the glorious Serpente family. These words immediately brought tears to the young lady's eyes, and pain, resentment, and fear appeared on her face. Amelia covered her mouth with her hand. She understood that now her own brother was inflicting terrible psychological trauma on her ward, which would be very difficult to get rid of. The firstborn raised his fork, preparing to say something else, but did not have time because he was interrupted. Benja got up from the table, walked up to his brother, and loudly called his name, causing him to turn around abruptly. The second son's face was distorted by the tension he was experiencing at that moment, and he noticed that his patience was coming to an end. Letias grinned evilly and reproached his brother for once again defending a low-born servant. Benja replied that this was true, and he did not see anything shameful in it. But on the contrary, he believed that he was doing the right thing. Hearing these words, the firstborn made a mocking expression and assumed that his brother had fallen in love. It was obvious how tense the second son was, but Letias, as if not noticing this, continued to talk about how sad love stories between aristocrats and commoners can be. Then the first son closed his eyes and laughingly remembered that some time ago, Benja had asked Amelia to sing him a lullaby. And before the younger brother's clenched fist touched the jaw of the main heir of Serpente, Letias managed to compare him to a famous lover named Romeo. The teenager screamed in sharp pain and immediately losing his balance, began to fall to the side and fall. The girls stood hugging each other and watched this scene with horror, while the maid asked Benja with undisguised surprise what he was doing. The second son caught his brother's falling body and grabbed him by the front of his shirt, while Amelia asked him to stop immediately and stop the fight. But the teenager was hard to stop because rage clouded his eyes, and he pounced on Letias again, punching him in the chest. At that moment, the boy did not look like a refined aristocrat, as he had before, but rather resembled a wild beast that had tasted human blood. Another blow threw the firstborn to the floor, and he made a hoarse sound reminiscent of a groan. However, the fight did not end there. The first son, squatting down, suddenly looked at his brother with a piercing and angry gaze. And then he suddenly straightened up and hit Benja with his elbow from below in the jaw, causing him to immediately stagger and drop to one knee. Letias quickly stood up and started yelling at his younger brother, accusing him of forgetting his place. The boy then added that all this time he had tolerated his antics and unworthy behavior only because he was his brother. But today, everything had changed. The girls had already stopped hugging each other and were now watching what was happening with horror. They still couldn't believe that this was actually happening. Letias then said that, after Benja raised his hand against him, he would no longer put up with this state of affairs, and prepared to kick the boy who covered himself with his hands. To make the boot kick stronger, Letias even ran as far as the space around him allowed. Wanting to protect the heir of the family, the maid, without thinking, threw herself between the victim and the attacking first son. Benja even tried to stop her, managing to scream for her not to do it. But it was too late, and the strongest blow hit the girl right in the stomach, causing her to be thrown up and folded in half, and then the unfortunate woman began to wheeze. Hellish pain spread throughout her body and paralyzed her thoughts, so that Amelia could not even scream. Only tears gushed from her eyes. Estelle, horrified by the sight of her own brother beating his beloved maid, lost her power of speech and covered her mouth with both hands. The girl let out a long groan, which turned into an ugly wheeze. She was in a lot of pain, and tears were flowing down her cheeks in a copious stream. Letias opened his mouth in amazement, because he had not planned to beat the girl at all. He just wanted to get even with his arrogant relative. Benja and Estelle ran up to the maid who was lying on her side, and groaning knelt down next to her, and then began to inquire about her well-being. The first son stood at some distance, right at the very spot where he had struck, and timidly justified himself by saying that he had not at all wanted to cause the maid pain or similar suffering. The younger sister sobbed over the body of her maid, writhing in pain, and kept shouting at Letias, calling him crazy, and trying to get an answer to the question of why he did this. Serpente's main heir looked pitiful and endlessly repeated several phrases that he did not want it to turn out this way, and in the end, he even began to apologize. Estelle added that none of her brothers could ever replace Amelia for her, because they couldn't even imagine how much the maid meant to her. The little girl continued to sob, and through her tears said that she wanted to get out of there more than anyone else, but she found the strength to hold back, and the maid helped her with this every day. Then the younger sister described her image in old age, when she is already elderly with wrinkles, and death takes her with it, because she is afraid that they are locked here forever or until they go crazy. At the end of this long indictment, Estelle said that after what had happened, she could only feel one thing for him: hatred even stronger than for their uncle Ivar. This psychological blow hit the very heart and turned out to be much more serious and painful than the blow from his younger brother. So Latias himself began to cry bitter tears. Because of the severe pain, the girl was unable to get up to go lie down in the room. She was only able to crawl to the nearest closet and lean her back on it, while the sensations in her body were frightening. Suddenly, Amelia heard someone calling her, very quietly opened her eyes, and looked in the direction from which the voice came. It was Latias. He appeared from behind the edge of the closet, and he looked like he was a guilty puppy who wanted to make up for his misdeed, but didn't know how. Looking at the candle burning in the candlestick, the boy asked how she felt, and if there was anything he could do to help. Amelia said that she was in pain, and that he could hardly help her with anything, and then added that it was her own fault because she had exposed herself to the blow, and she would not make such a mistake again. Lydius remembered that he said many different unpleasant words about the girl, but he wants her to know that he never really thought that way. The boy added that he behaved this way because he could not come to terms with the situation they found themselves in, could not accept the possible betrayal, and accumulated day after day the anger that he took out on her. The guy lowered his head guiltily and said that he was very sorry that this happened. Amelia closed her eyes and thought that she was too attached to this family, since even after such an act, she did not feel hostility, and said out loud that she understood that Latias did not want to hurt her. Then the girl looked at the open window, the curtains of which were fluttering in the wind, and asked if the first son had any thoughts about who could have done this to them if it was all a setup. The maid thought that if they could identify the circle of suspects, then maybe they could understand how to proceed further. The firstborn thought for a moment and replied that all the relatives had behaved kindly, but personally he was most suspicious of their uncle, Viscount Jerome Ivar. Latias suddenly froze, as if he remembered something, and added that the day before they moved to the shelter, he signed some documents, among which was a power of attorney to manage the family's assets. Amelia's eyes widened at this information, especially when the boy mentioned that he had also given the family seal of the Python Bank to his relatives as he had to go abroad. The girl suggested that the relatives initially wanted to gain control over the bank, and for this purpose imitated the departure of the children abroad to the Faya Empire. But why then lock them up since they already have power? The maid continued to think, because the aristocrats of the two neighboring kingdoms often visit each other, and the deception would soon be revealed, unless of course they sent dummy children there. And while the maid looking out the window was pondering the possible intrigues in the Serpente family, the boy spoke up and suggested that Estelle might have been right, and that their destiny was to grow old and die here. The heir added that if this was true, then he had no use for such a life, and then looked at the open brown frame behind which clouds and a blue sky were visible. The girl noted that the heir of a noble family should avoid such thoughts, because he bears great responsibility for the fates of many people, and not just his own. Amelia added that if he were gone, then who would lead the entire family and take care of all these people who trusted him? The boy was surprised and asked if he could really think about inheriting power when he could not control his emotions and was losing faith in his own strength every day. The maid smiled a little and replied that if he tried, then everything would definitely work out for him. It simply couldn't be any other way. Amelia looked out the window, trying to remember something, and then continued the conversation and mentioned her family. Moving slightly away from the closet, the girl laughed and added that her mother's distant ancestors were gypsies, which meant that she had inherited the ability to see what would happen. Then the maid painted a rosy picture of his bright future for the boy. But in order for all this to come true, he must work hard on himself. After some time, when Amelia recovered, Lydius came to her and his sister to sincerely ask for forgiveness, while Estelle remained very strict with the boy. However, it was not limited to just apologies, and since the firstborn hit her, he began to behave much better than before. The prisoners agreed not to discuss certain topics, so as not to accidentally repeat the quarrel. For example, this concerned the length of their stay within these stone walls. In the end, it turned out that excluding certain aspects of their lives from their communication definitely led to positive results: peace and warmer relationships. One day, Amelia was walking down the hallway and suddenly heard a strange noise coming from the library. The girl hurried inside and witnessed a serious fight between two brothers. But it was not a fist fight, but a battle on two sticks that were once parts of a ladder. The maid who was carrying a stack of books asked anxiously what they were doing and why they had sticks in their hands. Letias called Amelia little sister and said that he was very glad that she would witness their grand duel. The girl was surprised and asked again how it was possible to fight on the ruins of an old staircase. But the teenager said that this was quite enough for fencing training. The firstborn took a short break and reminded the maid of her own words about the need to constantly develop and work on themselves in order to achieve the desired goal and succeed. Turning away demonstratively, the brothers began to discuss their shortcomings and agreed that they should work hard and persistently to be worthy of their older sister. Amelia grabbed her head because she had not meant dangerous fights on half-rotten pieces of wood, but expected that the children would begin to develop intellectually and spiritually. Estelle, who had been watching the battle closely, said that she was very glad about this change in her brother's behavior, because after that incident and the conversation with the maid, they stopped quarreling. At this moment, Letius looked closely at his younger sister and said that she also had to start working on herself so as not to fall behind her relatives. The girl didn't like this idea at all. She tensed up and protested, saying that she felt fine as is, and then asked what she should do for self-development. The firstborn raised his finger and noted that Estelle was an aristocrat from the Serpente family, which meant that she would one day be at a royal ball, so she should be able to dance. The younger sister asked how she would study without music, when the only sound here was the howling wind from the window in the library, which they had converted into a playroom. The older brother added that the girl could not concentrate on her development because she was regularly ill, and besides, in order to learn to dance, it is not at all necessary to listen to music. Estelle tried to resist, but the teenager simply walked up, grabbed his sister under the arms, and dragged her to her room so she could change and get ready for dance class. When the little girl had changed her outfit, she returned to the playroom where a dance floor had been created between the cabinets, and the music was Benja's applause. It was a little strange and unusual to spin between tall bookcases full of books, but the older brother kept his sister firmly in the dance and helped her master each new movement. Not everything came easy, but with every minute spent doing this active activity, Estelle began to feel more confident and freer. Benja sat to the side with an unperturbed expression and clapped at certain equal intervals, thereby creating a clear rhythm for the movements. Finally, the dance was over, and the girl stopped to catch her breath. She was not at all used to such activity, especially in the last 2 months, when all she did was lie down and eat. It was hard to breathe, her legs hurt, and her head was a little dizzy. But overall, the little lady felt good. Finally, how then, having caught her breath, Estelle reproached her elder brother for leading the dance too quickly, to which the heir replied that everything was fine. She just wasn't used to it yet. After which Letias added that she should now train with Benya. But the younger sister really wanted to rest, and she began to protest against continuing the training. Then the firstborn turned to his younger brother and said that he was not tired at all, but just warmed up and wanted to continue the rehearsal, and therefore invited the boy to take his sister's place. The second son looked at the young aristocrat with bewilderment, then twirled his finger at his temple and suggested that he had gone crazy to make such a proposal, while Amelia began to giggle. However, Benja agreed that Estelle alone could not be a full-fledged partner for both brothers at once, because she was too inexperienced and small for this. The boy then looked at the maid who was holding a book in her hands at that moment and said that she could help them with their training, but the girl replied that she knew absolutely nothing about dancing. The second son extended his hand and replied that it didn't matter at all because they were learning now, and besides, it would be much easier for them to master the movements by twirling as two couples. Amelia timidly tried to object that she would never need it, and besides, she was not at all obliged by status to know how to dance. But the brothers insisted on her participation in joint training. Besides, Estelle really liked this idea, because now she was no longer the most inexperienced dancer, which meant she was no longer the last one on the list of dance skills. Laetius added that if they made two pairs at once, the training would be much faster and more interesting, and the little lady immediately offered to pick out a suitable dress for the maid. The girl tried to refuse because she felt awkward in the attire of a noblewoman, and besides, she didn't really like acting as a dress-up doll. And while the candle was burning, Benja, Estelle, and Amelia went to their rooms to change into clothes more suitable for free and uninhibited dance movements. The maid felt awkward being in someone else's dress. She even blushed a little and thought that strong embarrassment would reduce all her lessons to zero result. Noticing how shy their maid was in her expensive outfit, the serpente heirs hastened to assure her that the clothes suited her perfectly. Soon Benja came. He extended his hand and said that he would move slowly and try to explain everything as the training progressed. Realizing there was no turning back, Amelia resigned herself to her new role and placed her hand on the boy's hand, preparing for the upcoming lesson. The teenager carefully hugged his partner and said that the most important thing in dancing is to relax properly so that the music passes through the body without encountering resistance. Then the second son added that she should turn on her imagination and imagine the sound of a musical instrument in her head, and also mentally transport herself to a large dance hall. Amelia hung her head and replied that it would be difficult for her to create such an image because the only time she had ever been in such a room was to wipe the dust. However, Benja grabbed her firmly by the shoulders and said that all aristocrats come to the dance hall for the first time, and at first she would be scared and uncomfortable, but it would definitely pass. The young man said that to begin with, she needs to relax, at least her hands, and during the movement, look her partner in the eyes. This is necessary in order to feel each other. And this turned out to be the most difficult thing, because servants are always taught the opposite, to humbly lower their eyes and demonstrate obedience, while a direct look from a commoner can cause indignation. The teenager waited patiently, while the girl struggled with her internal attitudes and the role of an ordinary maid. Finally, Amelia was able to raise her head and maintain a direct gaze, eye to eye, although she didn't even really see Benja's face, because she was completely immersed in her own experiences. Latias kindly placed his hand on his little sister's head and noted that the maid was making great progress on her first day, and then laughed at the fact that his brother was also worried. When the couple began to make their first moves, the heir of Serpente could not stand it, and said that Amelia should step on her partner's feet more boldly, which caused indignation on his part. Suddenly, the girl remembered one curious detail. The thing was that according to the story, told in the novel, the main character returned from a trip abroad already with the skill of dancing. It was strange and unusual for a maid, because commoners very rarely know how to dance at the level of ordinary aristocrats, who are specially trained to do so. Yes, in the book, Amelia was a very unusual maid who always came to the next ball accompanied by two Serpente brothers. True, it cannot be said that such behavior caused recognition and approval from others, rather the opposite. The nobles took such antics extremely negatively because the main character was always dressed like a real aristocrat. She ate and drank with them, and this terribly angered and irritated them. However, it was impossible to simply expel a servant from high society, because then the full wrath of the powerful Serpente family could fall on the head of the offender, and no one wanted that. Thus, under the protection of powerful noble brothers, who controlled the Python Bank, Amelia was a commoner, with more power than many of the empire's nobles. So day after day, autumn flew by, and winter came. Flakes of white snow swirled outside the window, reminding us that time never stands still, but is always in motion. The maid saw the falling snow and remembered that they had been here for several months, during which time they had all changed a lot. The tower forged something new, previously unimaginable, out of these four people, because they had to get used to living in captivity and also cope with a lot of minor difficulties. It cannot be said that everything went smoothly. Periodically, prisoners fell into despair, went crazy, and succumbed to negative emotions. For example, they often banged their fists on the table. This time, Letius was furious that in the economic game they had come up with, he had borrowed money and was now forced to pay huge interest on the loan. Benja remained calm and noted that they had helped his company out at its most difficult moment, when he suffered a financial defeat, so now he should thank them properly. The second son and the younger sister sat together, dressed in warm winter clothes, and discussed how there was no room for emotions in business, only cold calculation and logic. Amelia entered the room and thought that economic games are very useful because they help to practice interaction between players and think through a strategy of behavior. However, the girl was somewhat confused by the fact that the Serpente Empire was initially built on lending money at high interest rates, and the children simply copied and developed this very model. Estelle greeted the maid, but suddenly bent over and sneezed loudly. Those present began to inquire about the girl's well-being. Maybe she had caught a cold? Amelia approached the little girl and adjusted the fur collar of her coat, and then asked if the girl was cold, to which she answered positively, and said that she was frozen. The brothers paused their game while the maid wrapped their sister in warmer clothing, patiently watching as a smile spread across the warming little lady's face. Latias noticed that with the onset of cold weather, the bell tower began to literally freeze from the inside, and everything around became icy. Benja agreed with his older brother, and noted that winter had only just begun, and they would have to endure several months of severe frosts before the spring warming. The first son suggested practicing fencing to at least somehow warm up, but the younger brother replied that they had enough training for today, since they were already tired from swinging sticks during the day. Amelia noticed that they really had little in the way of things they could use to keep warm, so physical activity was one of the few available ways to stay warm. The problem was that the tower had only one furnace, which worked constantly, but could not heat the room because it cooled down faster than it heated up. As for the idea of mass burning of books in order to raise the temperature in the tower, it had to be abandoned, as it turned out to be associated with the risk of starting a large fire. The problem also affected the laundry, which now had to be washed as rarely as possible because it did not dry well, and sometimes it simply froze right on the clothesline and had to be warmed up. Water treatments also became rare due to the insufficient amount of firewood which the children saved, but most of all, Amelia was worried about Estelle's failing health. Latias smiled and said that he had an idea on how to warm up quickly, although he suspected that not everyone would like it. The rest looked skeptically at the first heir, because very often his fantasies turned out to be not only meaningless and useless, but also dangerous antics. Meanwhile, the boy continued to smile slyly, and there was something frightening and unpredictable in that sinister look. Suddenly, the firstborn made a scary face and screamed that he was going to get someone, and then jumped high into the air and rushed at his younger brother. To everyone's surprise, the boy knocked his relative to the ground, but it was still unclear what he was really planning. The thought flashed through Benja's mind that a fight was about to start, but he was wrong because the first son, having knocked over his opponent, hugged him so tightly that he lost his breath. The younger brother tried to free himself, but Latias held him tightly to himself and even pressed his cheek against his cheek, saying how warm he really was. Finally, the blonde teenager was able to free his hand and push the Serpente's main heir's face away from his own. Then he continued to push and kick, saying that this was outrageous. The first son tried to persuade him, saying that it was not a very pleasant, but extremely effective method, but it was pointless. The younger brother flatly refused to hug him. At some point, Benja completely freed himself from the embrace and ran away. Then he stopped and said that he would prefer to freeze to death than to hug his unloved brother again. Latias was horrified by such words, and said that he was very disappointed by such impudent behavior of his loved one. The firstborn turned away and began to cry, asking Estelle if she had heard what his little brother had just said. However, the little lady did not console the offended nobleman, but instead of answering, she turned away and went into Amelia's arms. Then the girl turned around and noticed that the reason was most likely very simple and banal, because Latias was spreading an unpleasant smell over a long distance, which made one feel sick. The teenager was shocked by such a confession, and asked those around him if what his younger sister said was really true. But no one answered the boy, and then he lowered his head and said that he hadn't felt so bad morally for a long time. For a while, everyone retreated to the corners and did not even look at each other, but suddenly Estelle saw someone's hand grab her and drag her to the middle of the room. Same thing happened to Benja, who was surprised to find that he could not even resist this strong grip. It turns out that Latias had crept up unnoticed and decided to hug not only his younger brother, but everyone else as well. He gathered the children into an armful and hugged them tightly despite all their objections. Amelia resisted the least. Then the firstborn triumphantly declared that he was not going to give up and was ready to warm them even against their will. This is how he shows concern for each of them. And while the young men resisted, the girl began to feel that this simple plan was really working, because she and therefore the others became much warmer. When Latius got tired, he still had to let go of the resisting relatives, and at some point Benja's hand touched Amelia's hand. Then he stopped and thought. The teenager said that her hands were very cold, and the maid added that his own hand was cold as ice. Seeing his younger brother getting close to the maid, the firstborn took his sister by the shoulder to warm themselves together, but she rejected him and asked him to leave. Amelia looked at her hand which Benja was holding, and was surprised to note that not only her hand had warmed up, but that a strange and pleasant sensation of spreading warmth had appeared inside. This inner harmony and peace from the touch made the two hearts beat faster, and therefore the blood ran faster through the veins, and the body warmed up. Suddenly, unusual sounds, similar to footsteps, were heard from the corridor leading to the library, and this was strange because all the prisoners were now here in this room. Finally, the massive wooden door to the games room swung open, and on the threshold appeared none other than Viscount Jerome. When he saw the children, he even cried out in amazement. The heirs of Serpente had long since fallen asleep, and only Amelia, accustomed to waking up from every rustle of her ward, raised her head and looked at Sir Ivar with wide open eyes. The man was angry and asked what was going on here. Then the girl realized that this was not a dream at all, but reality. The maid turned her gaze to Estelle, who was sleeping covered with clothes next to her brothers. Judging by her appearance, one could tell that the girl was very cold and probably ill. Without waking up, the little lady muttered that she was very cold and covered her head. Then the man called Amelia to him and asked not to wake the children. Jerome lowered his voice to a whisper and repeated his words, but more quietly, and then remained standing in the doorway, expecting the maid to carry out his order immediately. Amelia felt angry. She had not seen her eldest master for many months, and then suddenly he appeared just when they, in an attempt to warm up, were all sleeping together on the floor by the stove. The girl felt awkward about being caught sleeping with the aristocrats, but they simply left her no other choice, because if they went to their rooms, they would freeze. But it was warmer this way. In addition, the maid was ashamed that she had allowed herself this weakness, but according to her status, she was not supposed to do such things even out of a sense of self-preservation. And also the maid gave in to weakness and went to bed, leaving the stove unattended without extinguishing the flame which could have led to a fire. Amelia stood up, collected the coals from the stove into a large bowl, and followed the gentleman out of the library. For some reason, she was sure that he would not appear until spring. The maid was very worried about the Viscount's first reaction when he entered the playroom. She tried to understand what had made him so angry. Was it really her sleeping together with his nephews? And while they were walking down the corridor, the girl went through a lot of different options for how further events might develop in her head. Over these long months, she had greatly changed her opinion of him, and now Sir Ivar was the personification of deception and uncertainty. The girl quickened her pace, following the man, and thought that maybe he would still release them, because he could have killed them long ago, but he continues to feed them and provide them with some supplies. Most of all, the maid hoped for his feelings for the children, because everything she saw before their imprisonment was full of love, respect, and sincere affection. The maid was thinking about what emotions this unpredictable man was now experiencing towards the heirs of the family, and where this would lead them all. At last, they reached the drawing room, and Amelia placed the bowl of coal on the table, and then turned to the Viscount to begin the dialogue. Sir Jerome began by demanding that the maid explain to him how this outrageous event could have happened. The girl immediately understood that he would not tell her anything good, and so she decided to just remain silent and listen. Without waiting for an answer, the man turned to the non-working fireplace on which stood a clock that had stopped many years ago, and waited a little longer, but the maid remained silent. Then Ivar turned and noted that since she did not want to talk, he would do it for her, and he wanted to start with the terrible and unforgivable mistake she had made. Sir Jerome's face even twisted with anger, after which he held another long pause. Finally, the man covered his eyes with his hand and groaned that he would never forgive himself for entrusting his nephews to such a terrible person as Amelia, because he trusted her and she let him down. Then the maid spoke up and replied that she did not quite understand what her master was talking about. The Viscount noted that her mother had never dared to cross that invisible line that always separated an aristocrat from a commoner, and he had hoped that the nanny's daughter had inherited this quality, but this was not the case. Then Sir Jerome's eyes grew scary, and he literally hissed, asking how she dared share a sleeping bed with his own nephews. After which, the man pointed his finger at the girl and suggested that this was her cunning and insidious plan, which she had been planning for a long time, and now the opportunity had come to implement it. Amelia was so shocked by these accusations that she could not even find the words to explain the situation. She clenched her fist in anger and thought that this man who locked children against their will and forcibly kept them in harsh conditions dared to accuse her of such a trifle as sleeping for the sake of warmth. The Viscount was silent for a moment, and then continued, and told how he had chosen her only because of Estelle. Then the maid listened to a short story about how Jerome's brother and his wife treated her mother, their children's nanny, well, and how she herself constantly looked after her niece. But Ivar is outraged that she allows herself to sleep with children of noble blood, to which the girl hastened to object that this is just an awkward misunderstanding, and she will now explain everything. Amelia looked down at the floor and began to cry, after which she told her that the nights here were very cold, and the only way to warm Lady Estelle was to press her body against hers. The man with his mouth open listened to the story about how the maid was very afraid that the little lady would catch a cold, so she, overcoming her shame and fear, was forced to do such an act. The maid looked up and added that she was grateful to fate and to her lord for the opportunity to serve the glorious Serpente family, and especially such a sweet noblewoman as Estelle. Amelia decided to appease the Viscount so that he would release the heirs from captivity as soon as possible, since he cared so much about their status. Then they had a chance of salvation. Then the maid said that the young gentleman and the little lady were very kind to her, and at the same time mentioned that she herself could do nothing except light the stove. The girl also added that with a feeling of deep shame, she was forced to temporarily put on noble clothes, because if she freezes to death, who will take care of Estelle? The maid saw how attentively the tyrant who had restricted their freedom and imprisoned them in the tower was listening to her, but what could she do except awaken in him pity and sympathy for the prisoners? Having said many flattering words, Amelia finally decided to ask her main question. When will their lordship allow the nephews to leave the shelter? There was silence in the room for a while, and it was clear that the Viscount was thinking deeply about something. Then he collected his thoughts and gave an answer. Sir Ivar agreed with the idea that children have a hard time now, but they find the strength and opportunity to take care of those around them, for example, their maid. The girl smiled and said that she confirmed every word he said, because they were so kind to her that she did not deserve it at all. Suddenly, the man stopped mid-sentence, as if he remembered something, and said that she should follow him to help with something. When they approached the mirrored door, they saw Harris standing on this side of the opening, and behind him they could see a large number of all kinds of boxes, chests, and suitcases. The Viscount pointed to the supplies and added that she must help the chamberlain bring all the items inside, and that this must be done as quickly as possible before the children woke up and found them there. Amelia went down to the next step and saw an impressive amount of various equipment needed to solve everyday issues. Harris didn't even greet the girl, but only asked his master what else he could do for him. The man thought about it, but didn't answer, and continued to stand on the top steps and think about something of his own, while the girl began to think about what she would do with all this good stuff. At last, Sir Jerome came to his senses and told the maid that she must hurry. Amelia apologized for her slowness and said that she would immediately begin moving the items into the tower area. And when the maid reached out to the first box, she clearly understood that all this could only mean one thing, that they would remain here for a very, very long time. Suddenly, the maid's attention was drawn to the light. She did not immediately understand where it was coming from, but when it became clear, she began to think. Just behind the mirrored door was another door that led there to freedom to the outside world, that the prisoners had been dreaming about for months. This door leading to the old calm and gentle world was open and beckoned Amelia, just as an oasis full of water and fresh greenery beckons a traveler in a dry desert. The thought of escaping immediately came into her head, because Harris and Uncle Ivar were on this side, and they simply wouldn't have time to intercept her, and she would fly out like a bird. Yes, they will shout after her and try to catch up, but does it matter when there is enticing freedom waiting for her ahead? The maid will run faster than she has ever run in her life, because she will be striving for her dream. Amelia will descend the steep steps of the bell tower and run out into the street, where she hasn't been for probably half a year. And then the maid stopped, because what would happen next, where would she go, everything she had, was here on this side of the mirror door, and in that big and free world, she was nobody. This thought that she had nowhere to run burned the girl with cold from the inside, because she realized that her attempt to escape would end very badly for everyone, especially for Estelle. The maid was brought back from this mental escape by a rude shout from Sir Jerome, who irritably reminded her that she was going to help Harris quickly bring in his things. Full of sadness, sorrow, and melancholy, Amelia turned to the call of her master and found an unexpected picture. Without waiting for help, Viscount Ivar himself began to carry boxes and chests to the tower territory, which was very unlike an aristocrat. Apparently, he was really in a hurry. The girl touched her forehead with her hand and came to the conclusion that she was starting to go a little crazy from such a long confinement and was losing her adequacy and common sense. Before closing the door behind him, Uncle Jerome paused briefly in the doorway and said that he did not know when he would be able to allow the children to leave the tower, but he would do everything to make it happen sooner. Then the man promised that this would happen quite soon, but when exactly he himself does not yet know. And finally, the Viscount asked Amelia to look after and care for his nephews, as she had done before, to which the maid replied that she would make every effort to do so. When the door bolts dropped on the other side, and the mechanism that unlocked the door fell silent, the girl continued to stand in front of the mirror for some time and look at its smooth, cold surface. Suddenly, the maid found herself thinking that more than disliking this stern man, she felt gratitude towards him for the fact that Sir Ivar had supplied them with a large quantity of supplies. Uncle Jerome did not free them, but only gave them some hope, which for many months will now fuel their thirst for freedom, and the belief that someday they will still get out of here. Amelia raised her head and looked high up where the spiral staircase went. She wondered what the Viscount had meant when he promised to free them soon. And while the maid's head was spinning with dark and disturbing thoughts about their future, Ledius came up from behind and stared in surprise at the mountain of supplies, and then asked a question about where all this came from. The boy was very happy with such unexpected gifts, but he was very interested in where the maid found all this. Amelia answered evasively that apparently these supplies were left by their uncle, who came to them while they were sleeping. One morning, about 3 months after the Viscount's last visit, the maid who had dozed off at the table was awakened by someone shaking her shoulder. It was Estelle. The girl looked very sick and pale. She timidly reported that the brothers had quarreled again, and during the conflict they had seriously damaged the furniture in the kitchen. The maid became alarmed and said that she would immediately go there to assess the scale of the conflict that had occurred. The fact is that this harsh winter was very difficult for the heirs of serpente quarrels, and conflicts became more frequent. But most of all, they were worried about the health of little Estelle, who was only getting worse. The spring sunset was unusually beautiful these days. Winter had finally retreated. The days became longer and much warmer, even in the evenings. With a familiar movement, Amelia jumped out of the window and landed on the back of the stone statue right next to Benya, and then asked what happened and why did he miss dinner. Apparently, the second son was clearly not in a good mood. He coldly remarked that she should not have come because he wanted to be alone today and did not want to see anyone. The blonde girl replied that she had seen a frightened Estelle and that she had reported a quarrel between the brothers, as well as destruction in the kitchen, and she had come to see if he had any injuries. The boy smiled and noted that his younger sister, as usual, was exaggerating everything, and as for the fight, only the food on the plate had been seriously damaged, nothing more. Benja added that he was fine, and she could return to her charge, who always needed attention, but the girl did not move from her place, but continued to sit and look into the distance. Thoughts flashed through the maid's head that if the heir's parents were alive, they would never have allowed what was happening to the children, now both physically and morally. These bright and kind people would undoubtedly be horrified to see what terrible events were happening to their beloved daughter and sons. The maid noted that she understood why Benja was behaving this way, but she also understood his older brother, who was under serious pressure from his younger brother. But the young aristocrat replied that Latias was always the first to start a conflict, and all he could do was react and defend himself because he could not ignore his words and actions. The second son noted that his older brother has a special status as the main heir of the entire family, so he must learn to behave like a leader who guides and supports others. Then Benja buried his head in his knees and added that it hurt him to see Amelia and Estelle suffering, but patiently hiding their pain while Latias was indignant at the slightest discomfort. The girl realized that the second son's impudent behavior was caused not so much by a difficult character, but by an attempt to train his older brother and prepare him for the difficulties of the post of duke. The young aristocrat raised his head and added that he had thought a lot about the situation they were in, and was also trying to understand who was a friend and who was an enemy. Benja also pondered the topic of who turned out to be the snake and the traitor, and why the villains decided to temporarily save their lives rather than kill them and make them prisoners in their own estate. After these words, the young nobleman was silent for a long time, and Amelia waited for a while for these arguments to continue, and then asked herself what conclusion he had come to. The boy made a scary face and replied that he now felt a deep dislike for those people who talk about their care and love, but in reality put them on the brink of survival. Benja added that the villains are only trying to appear wise and cunning, but in reality they are weak and stupid people who took advantage of the tragedy in their family. The teenager remembered the image of Uncle Jerome and noticed that their opponents spoke of kindness and their desire to protect the heirs, but their actions testified to something completely different to betrayal. The second son was silent for a moment and continued that he wanted to play on the weaknesses of his enemies and their inability to control their emotions, and thought that success awaited him. Benja's eyes lit up with an ominous light, and he said that his strength was that his opponents considered him a weak and helpless little boy. But the time would come, and he would show what he was capable of. Amelia was surprised to realize what metamorphoses were taking place in the mind of the second heir of Serpente, but she was alarmed by his phrase that he could no longer count on Latias. The maid remarked that even though the firstborn made mistakes, he would always remain his brother, but the boy did not listen to her and continued to talk about how he would definitely get out of here. Based on the plot of the novel, the girl knew that after a long absence, the children returned home, and no one raised the question of what exactly happened to the heirs during this time. This could only mean one thing: that the villains responsible for their imprisonment did not suffer any punishment, and perhaps were even rewarded for their care and guardianship of the descendants of Serpente. However, Amelia knew that somewhere out there right now, the main character of this work was living and actively working, and he would definitely make himself known at the right moment. Meanwhile, the maid listened as the boy continued his reasoning, in which he came to the conclusion that in this world you can't trust anyone, even if they are your closest relatives. Trying to maintain his trust, the maid touched his hand, and then Benja began to ask her forgiveness for not being able to reveal his entire plan to her right now. Amelia tried to convince the teenager that not all people are bad. Many sincerely care about others and love them. They just met a few bad characters on their way. Then the girl looked at the teenager's sad face and added that one cannot just write off his older brother, who is as much a victim of circumstances as he is. The maid squeezed the second son's hand, smiled, and said that there was no need to become cruel to everyone if someone had been cruel to you. Besides, Amelia already knew the continuation of this story and understood that the heirs of Serpente were only secondary characters, and the main events would unfold around a completely different persons. Night fell on the family estate, and all the inhabitants of the tower, where the bell tower and the large stone statue of the gargoyle are located, went to sleep in their rooms. Estelle, as usual, slept in the arms of her nanny. It was much calmer for her, because if she woke up, which happened often, she immediately saw a familiar face in front of her. But that night, it was the maid who woke up. First, she opened her eyes, ran her hand over her face, and thought, why did it become so unbearably hot around? As drowsiness faded into the background, she immediately turned her gaze to her charge and what she saw shocked her. The heat that woke the maid came from the little girl, who lay all hot and breathing heavily. Benja went into his sister's room before that he went to the bathroom to fill a new bowl with cool water and asked how she felt. A worried Amelia replied that cold compresses had not yet been able to bring down the temperature. Then the maid added that they didn't have any medicine, so she didn't know what else to do to help the poor girl in such a situation, and then Benja asked if she herself was sick. However, the maid replied that it would be best if the brothers temporarily stopped communicating with the girls. In case the disease turned out to be contagious, then everything would become much worse. Amelia reached over to replace the compress on the girl's face and heard her second son express concern about her fatigue and the possibility of her also becoming ill from her charge. The girl, of course, wanted to sleep, but she could not allow a situation in which she would fall asleep, and Estelle would suddenly need urgent help. Suddenly, the little girl moaned, and without opening her eyes, called the maid by name, and then in a weak and quiet voice said that she was very cold. The little lady looked very ill. She had a fever. Amelia put her hand on her head and literally burned herself from how high her temperature was. The girl looked at the suffering child and felt terrible because she could do nothing to cure the girl, or at least ease her suffering. The maid rushed from floor to floor, carefully insulating and warming Estelle's room. But the situation did not change. The fever continued unabated. In addition, she began to rapidly lose weight. Everything indicated that the child's body was not coping with the illness and was quickly losing ground, so Amelia began to seriously worry that her charge might die in a few days. It was hard for the maid to watch her cheeks sink and her hair become dull and lifeless, her skin lose its pinkish hue and become white or greenish. The girl really hoped that Harris would read the note she wrote, because the relatives couldn't just let the girl burn out from an unknown disease. Amelia wondered whether her message had been deliberately ignored, or whether the chamberlain had direct orders from the Viscount to throw away notes without reading them. Could it be that Uncle Jerome, who was so outraged that the maid allowed herself to sleep with his niece, had lost all feeling and would not react in any way to the girl's illness? Suddenly, a simple and clear thought came into the girl's head. It was that she couldn't wait any longer. She needed to act. But what exactly should she do? The plan turned out to be quite simple. If it was impossible to get help inside the shelter, it was necessary to leave these walls at any cost, and the best opportunity was when there was a night shift of dishes. Amelia understood perfectly well that she was risking everything, the owner's attitude, her job, and even her life. But she could no longer look at the dying child, so she waited until the cart was taken away. At the appointed time, when everyone had gone to bed, Harris opened the mirror door, took the dish transport, and drove it somewhere deep into the tower. Suddenly, the man stopped and noticed that the weight of the stand on wheels had changed dramatically. It had become much heavier than usual. Soon a woman approached him. She tried to push the cart and agreed with her colleague. The unknown maid noted that the other servants were beginning to increasingly inquire about the reason why she went to the chapel so often at night. Harris replied that she should come up with some reason, such as that my lord had ordered her to clean the place on a regular basis, and the woman added that they should hurry. The servants turned, the cart rolled it out of the tower, and headed straight towards the mansion, where at that very moment preparations for the upcoming banquet were in full swing. The great hall was very light and bright, as it had never been in the dungeon at the top of the tower. Dozens of servants were bustling around the event. Some were setting out dishes, others were carrying food, others were arranging furniture, so no one paid attention to the cart that was being wheeled past the main staircase. The rapid clatter of feet from different directions constantly reached the ears of the one hiding under the blanket. Finally, all the sounds around died down, which meant that the woman had brought the food stand to a place where there was no one, and it was possible to leave her shelter. It was scary after so many months spent locked up to find myself again in a large house filled with endless sounds. But there was nowhere to retreat, so Amelia carefully lifted the edge of the white blanket and began to look around. Having made sure that the area around was really empty, the girl carefully began to crawl out of her hiding place. Fortunately, the cart was spacious enough for such a fragile girl, and Harris was too busy preparing for the banquet to understand the reasons for the extra weight. The maid imagined what would have happened if Benja or even Latias had been in her place, since their weight was much greater than her own. However, it didn't matter. Now it was necessary to concentrate on where the nanny ended up. Apparently, it was a room for tea ceremonies. In addition, it was necessary to change clothes immediately because the ones Amelia had on when she arrived here in the cart would have instantly given her away. Fortunately, the traditions and rules in the house were quite stable and strictly observed, so the maid quickly found a spare set of clothes in the right place. The girl quickly changed her clothes and could now move more or less freely around the house, since from afar she would not arouse anyone's suspicions. The maid took the jug in her hands and could now easily tell one of the senior servants that she was going on an errand for one of the masters. Moving carefully around the house, Amelia wondered if any of the previous staff were still in the house since much time had passed, and the plague had spared no one. Suddenly, someone called out to the girl from behind by a strange name Abel, and gave the order to go to the kitchen and see what condition the birthday cake was in. The maid pretended to go on an errand, but she went on and stopped at the door to the main hall, where there were a lot of servants, and everyone was busy with something. Amelia began to observe and look for familiar faces among the people in uniform, but she saw almost all of them for the first time. The maid went on further, and as soon as she met one of the servants on the way, she immediately pretended that she was carrying out some important task and tried to turn her back to them. The fugitive's plan was quite simple. Find Viscount Jerome as soon as possible, tell him what had happened to Estelle, and ask for help. And suddenly, a completely different idea came to Amelia's mind. Maybe she should seek salvation not from Sir Ivar at all, but from someone else, because he had already proven that his word could not be trusted. Over the course of time and his rare visits, this man had completely lost the trust of both the maid and his nephews. But who should I turn to for help if even my own uncle behaved so treacherously? And maybe there are those in the house who wish the heir's immediate death. Suddenly, the girl stopped near a large bouquet of beautiful flowers and caught herself thinking that she had been deprived of the opportunity to look at such living beauty for many months. After wandering around the mansion for some time, Amelia decided to find Viscount Jerome first, and in the meantime, the halls began to fill with guests who began to dance and chat. Having climbed onto the balcony to get a better view of the assembled aristocrats, the maid began to look for Ivar in the crowd, and soon discovered the man standing with a glass of wine in his hand. The girl felt disgusted by the fact that this man was laughing, joking, and having fun to the fullest, while his niece had been lying delirious for 3 days and was dying. As for the celebration itself, it was not much different from those the maid had seen before, except that the real owners of the house were nowhere to be found. Estelle just at that moment tried to get out of bed, but she felt dizzy from weakness and fell back onto the bed. The boys stood in the next room and cried from helplessness and fear. This situation, full of uncertainty, was driving them crazy. Amelia looked down at the contented people and realized that this world was full of injustice when guests enjoyed life and the real owners died of illness or suffered from imprisonment. The maid watched the merry celebration for some time and then decided to turn to Sir Jerome, as she did not want to risk communicating with unfamiliar nobles. Suddenly, the girl heard footsteps. Someone was climbing the stairs and would soon appear right in front of her. The maid froze in surprise, not knowing what to do, because she had to keep an eye on Viscount Ivar, so as not to lose sight of him and take advantage of the moment when he would be alone. However, Amelia could not remain on the balcony and simply look at the guests, because it would be conspicuous and could lead to her exposure and capture. The girl had not yet seen the person who was climbing the stairs, but she assumed that the person was heading specifically towards her, and even thought that it could be Harris. Finally, the young man climbed the stairs, and finding himself on the balcony, walked up to the railing and stopped. Amelia stared at the guy, not knowing what she should expect from this stranger. The young man looked pale and tired, giving the impression that he wanted to escape from this motley crowd of aristocrats, and came here in search of at least some privacy. Having made sure that he had no intention of communicating with the servants, the maid sighed with relief and then began to examine his image, since these facial features seemed familiar to her. The combination of light hair and violet eyes is quite a rare occurrence, and in the novel that the girl read in her past life, this combination of appearance was found only in one character. To confirm her suspicions, Amelia crept closer and hid behind a huge flower pot, then began to watch. The guy walked to the edge of the balcony and carefully peered out from behind the railings. Soon voices were heard from below. These were people who were looking not for an ordinary nobleman, but for the crown prince himself. The girl's assumption was confirmed. Apparently, the first prince of the Empire Xerxes was really standing in front of her now, which was simply incredible. However, the teenager did not look like a powerful ruler. Rather, he was hiding from his retinue, which he began to discuss out loud right on the balcony, and then suggested that he needed to look for a new refuge. While in her hiding place, the maid lowered her head and began to remember the plot of the novel, which said that the young heir to the empire is the main character of the entire work. As the boy approached the flower pot, Amelia knew she had to act because this might be her only chance to save Estelle and free her brothers from captivity. The girl read enough about this man to understand that he could really help her and save everyone, and so she prepared to ask him for help. The teenager hurriedly left the balcony, fleeing from the courtiers, and the maid quietly followed him, thinking along the way about the words she had to say to explain everything. And at the moment when Amelia called out to her potential savior, she was suddenly grabbed by the arm. It was the one the maid was looking for at the very beginning, Viscount Jerome. Now he stood in front of her, and his eyes were full of horror. He asked how she got here. Ivar, as usual, began the conversation with accusations that the girl not only dared to leave the tower, but also tried to talk to the heir to the empire, which was not at all part of her uncle's plans. The man was also interested in the question of how exactly the naughty girl managed to escape from captivity in the tower under the bell tower. In the Viscount's tight grip, the maid replied in a plaintive voice that they had no intention of disturbing His Highness and leaving the shelter, but Estelle was dying, so she was here. Sir Jerome relaxed his grip and asked again what had happened to his niece, and then the girl told of a high temperature and the fading of life in the little lady's frail body. The man was shocked by what he heard, but instead of answering, he began to repeat the girl's name, as if trying to comprehend this information, which did not fit into his head. Sir Ivar then handed Amelia over to Harris, who quickly led the brave girl back to the tower and the passage. Having opened the mirror door, the chamberlain rudely threw the unfortunate woman onto the stone floor, and then began to curse and threaten that he should immediately kill her for such a prank. Seeing the maid, the brothers immediately ran to her to find out what happened and how she ended up outside. Latias sat down next to her, lifted the girl up, and hugged her, saying that they were very worried about her and were glad that she was safe. Having come to her senses a little, Amelia began to tell that she had found a way to leave the shelter, and then went to the mansion to find their uncle and report on Estelle's grave condition. When she met Sir Ivar, he called Harris, and he brought her back, and he went to visit the little lady. At this time, the Viscount was already in his niece's room. He leaned over her bed and began to assess the state of the illness, and also affectionately called the girl by name. The man was wearing white gloves, but even through them he felt the incredible heat that emanated from the body, and especially from the head of the sick heiress of Serpentes. Finally, the little girl opened her eyes and looked at her uncle, but she did not recognize him, and began to call Amelia, and then she began to cry, and tears flooded her face. Sir Jerome was shocked by the little lady's grave condition, and tried to explain that it was he who was in front of her, but Estelle did not listen to him and continued to call for the maid. Then the girl fell silent, gathered the rest of her strength, raised her hand, and grabbed Sir Ivar by the sleeve of his clothes. After this, the sick heiress of Serpente began to moan and say that she was in great pain. The Viscount opened his mouth to reply, but the words stuck in his throat, so he remained silent, unable to formulate a thought. The next minute, the door quietly opened behind Uncle Ivar, but he did not turn around, but continued to look into the eyes of his dying relative. The Serpente brothers and their maid, who had already recovered a little from Harris's rough grip, stood on the threshold. They stood in silence for a moment, and then quietly called out to Sir Jerome. Amelia said that now the gentleman himself was convinced that Estelle needed serious medical care, which could not be provided in confinement. Then the maid added that the situation was rapidly deteriorating, and that regular pills were no longer effective, and that something drastic and serious was needed to cure it. The Viscount listened silently to this emotional speech and looked the girl straight in the eyes. It was unclear what he was going to do, and whether he would do anything at all regarding Estelle. Amelia raised her voice and tried to find new arguments in favor of the fact that the little lady needed to be rescued immediately. Sir Ivar's eyes were full of horror, but he still said nothing, just stood and watched. Suddenly, a strong blow from the corner of a heavy book, directly to the head, interrupted the girl's speech, and she screamed and fell to the floor. The Chamberlain remarked that Sir Jerome should not have come here, for he could cope with all these new difficulties very well himself. The man shifted the book to his other hand, looked at how the brothers were trying to bring the maid to her senses, and added that the banquet was in full swing, and therefore Viscount Ivar should return to the guests. Hearing such words from the servants, Lettius became furious and quickly turned to Harris. The boy called out to the Chamberlain and demanded to explain how he dared to hit his maid. Benja also reacted quite emotionally and came to the aid of his older brother. He shouted at the man, accusing him of indecent and outrageous behavior. Then the second son clenched his fist and added menacingly that no one dares raise a hand against Amelia. Benja immediately tried to back up his words with action, and running up, swung his fist straight at Harris's face. The Chamberlain clearly did not expect such a reaction, and the next moment he was already looking at the ceiling of the room, finding himself on the floor. The teenager managed to knock the man down and throw him to the floor, and then he sat on top of him and began to strike him, from which the servant began to cover himself with his hands. Harris immediately began to beg for mercy and asked the young gentleman to stop the beating, after which the boy eased up on the pressure. But the man only feigned weakness. In fact, he immediately took advantage of the opportunity and delivered a crushing blow with his white-gloved fist. Benja missed the attack and immediately stopped fighting because he was barely able to keep from falling to the floor. Trying to recover from the blow he had received, the teenager caught himself thinking that he had allowed his opponent to deceive him in a mean way. Amelia screamed in horror when she saw how harshly and cold-bloodedly the servant dealt with her second son. At this time, Benja was still standing on his feet, covering his face with his hand from the injury he had received. The maid covered herself with her hands from what she saw, and Lettius froze in amazement. He never expected that the Chamberlain would dare to raise his hand against his brother. Without thinking twice, the firstborn grabbed the first thing that came to hand. It was a heavy candlestick. Harris saw the attack coming and prepared to defend himself against the heir of the Serpente family. At the top of the object was a sharp sting, which was intended to hold the wax candle in a vertical position, and it was with this that Lettius wanted to deliver a stabbing blow. The Chamberlain took a defensive stance and raised his fists up, intending to intercept the candlestick, or at least dodge the threat. The young aristocrat threw a powerful blow, but Harris put both hands out to catch it, and partially succeeded. Suddenly, Viscount Jerome shouted at the boy that he must immediately stop his behavior unworthy of an heir. Sir Ivar hurried to the servant to find out how he was feeling and how serious the injury was. The uncle began to yell at the firstborn, accusing him of behaving very badly and thus disgracing the entire Bright Serpente family. Jerome added that Harris had taken good care of his nephews all these long months, and to raise a hand against him would be to be an ungrateful and cruel man. Lettius was taken aback by such a hypocritical remark from his relative, and reminded him of his sick sister, as well as the beating of Amelia and his younger brother. But Ivar did not listen, and hurried away, leading the servant away. Instead of answering, the uncle shouted that his nephew should immediately shut up and stop his disgraceful behavior towards Harris, after which Sir Jerome turned away and headed towards the mirror door, saying that he had been very wrong about the boy on whom he had placed great hopes. Finally, the Viscount noted that he was now thinking about leaving the heirs in the tower forever. Amelia tried to say something and raised her hand, but no one listened to her, after which the heavy door slammed loudly. For a while the girl stood there unable to move. She thought about how their life would change after what happened, and whether they would even have this life. These heavy thoughts were interrupted by Benja. He came up from behind and asked how the girl was feeling. Amelia came to her senses and replied that she was fine, and in turn asked about the young gentleman's well-being. There was sadness and fear on the girl's face, because she had started this night sortie to save Estelle, but in the end she had brought even greater trouble upon all the prisoners. The little lady was still in bad shape. She was lying on the bed and moaning in pain, and tears were running down her cheeks. Most of all, Amelia was worried that the Chamberlain would take revenge on them. She didn't know how, but a lot depended on him, and this man could not only deprive them of food, but also add poison to the dish. The maid lowered her head and thought that in any case, they now clearly saw that Sir Ivar like Harris would not mind at all if some misfortune happened to the heirs. The bright sun illuminated the green foliage, and nature rejoiced along with the midday sun at each new line of the song that the mother sang to her daughter. Amelia lay on the soft grass, resting her head on the lap of her beloved parent, and listened to her sing a lullaby to her. The sound of her beloved's voice calmed her soul and relaxed her mind, so for a while the girl completely surrendered to his enchanting vibrations. However, thoughts about the accumulated problems could not leave the daughter's mind, and she began to talk to her mother about the situation she found herself in. Seeing that Amelia was no longer listening to the song, the blonde girl stopped singing and began to examine her baby. But when the girl briefly told about everything that had happened, the mother suddenly smiled and noted that everything was fine, and these words really scared her daughter. After this, the woman covered the girl's face with her hand and said that she could sleep some more, or she could wake up as she wanted. When the fingers completely blocked out the daylight, Amelia asked how her mother knew that she wanted to rest more than ever before. Then the woman leaned towards her ear and replied that death and sleep were very similar, and she should think about it. At these words, the maid suddenly woke up and realized that all this was just an obsession. However, the maid did not wake up. Just like that, Benja woke her up. He made a gesture showing that they should not make noise. Amelia thought that she had probably dozed off after spending the whole night next to Estelle, whose temperature, by the way, was starting to drop a little. The second son whispered that they should talk, but in order not to wake his sister, he suggested leaving the room. The maid took the basin to change the water for the cold compresses, and the young people carefully walked out into the corridor. But when they entered the bathroom together, the girl immediately dropped the container on the floor. What Amelia saw was truly terrible and left her in absolute shock, although over the months spent in the tower, she had learned to take any news calmly. On the floor, near a puddle of water, lay a pair of bloody scissors, and from the bathtub itself, a wide stream of water tinted scarlet flowed out. The taps were open at full capacity, and water was noisily pouring out of them into a container that was already full to the brim. But something else was scary. Letias was floating in the bathtub, his hand thrown over the edge, and bloody marks were visible on his light shirt, washed away by the abundant flow of water. The eyes of the firstborn were closed, but it was impossible to determine from a distance whether he was breathing or not. Nevertheless, this picture was an extremely depressing sight. Amelia and Benja hurried to pull the boy out of the water and tightly bandage his wounds, and then together they carried the heir of Serpente into the room. After some time, Letius opened his eyes and began to look around, and then sat up on his bed. The girl was very glad that the young gentleman had woken up, but she was very worried about his emotional state, because only people who have lost their thirst for life decide to commit suicide. However, the younger brother had a slightly different opinion. He shouted at the teenager and accused him of stupidity and cowardice. Then Benja ran up to Letius and grabbed him by the shirt with his hand, and angrily added that if he ever decided to commit suicide again, he should jump out of the window so as not to pollute the air. The firstborn looked at his brother in silence, and there was emptiness in his eyes. No reaction, resentment, or anger, only uncomplaining submission and a complete lack of desire. The second son noticed that they were already in a difficult situation without his antics, and now, instead of options for solving problems, the main heir Serpente was throwing up new troubles. Letias listened to all the accusations indifferently, without trying to resist object or justify himself in any way. Finally, Benja let go of his older brother's clothes and said at the end that he was facing a real egoist. Then the younger brother turned around and headed for the exit, while the firstborn silently lowered his head, and only Amelia tried to calm her enraged brother, but she did not succeed. The girl turned her gaze to Letias and thought about how hard it must be for him mentally right now. The teenager really was not like his former self, active, cheerful, and impudent. Now he was in an extremely depressed state. After standing next to the bed for a while, the maid decided to leave the boy to gain strength and left the room. Leaving Letias's chambers, Amelia ran to catch up with his younger brother, who had already managed to climb a little up the spiral staircase. The girl caught up with him very quickly, called out to him and asked him to stay a little longer to listen to her. The maid noticed that Benja was very cruel to his brother and asked him to show him at least some leniency. The second son thought for a moment, because the situation was indeed dangerous and threatening. Then the younger brother said that the Lydias he knew before was no longer with them. He had left them and never returned, and instead of a proud heir before them was his pitiful shadow. The previous heir of the family was self-confident, full of strength, and able to overcome difficulties. But now his place has been taken by a weak-willed, helpless, and hopeless weakling. But the worst thing is that the first son decided to abandon his younger sister and brother in a moment of danger, something that Litias, who was to become the Duke of Serpente, would never have done. Benja then raised his hand to his face and asked Amelia if she thought they could get out of here, because he was increasingly thinking that all this suffering was a waste of time. The maid understood that the teenager was on the verge of despair, which his older brother had already crossed, so she had to at all costs find the right words and comfort him. The girl threw herself on the guy's neck, hugged him, and said that she felt with all her heart that in 6 months they would all get out of here. Looking at the gray steps of the spiral staircase, the teenager asked how this was possible. Would they really be able to overcome the Chamberlain and thus be saved? Amelia replied that it was true together. They would be able to kill Harris and gain their long-awaited freedom. And then Benja asked what would happen to those who had plotted against their family. The maid thought for a while. She knew the approximate outcome, but she saw that some events were not going as in the novel, which meant she could change the storyline. Finally, the girl decided that she would fight this world since her confrontation in the past world ended in failure, and replied that they would deal with everyone who had harmed them. Meanwhile, Viscount Jerome was returning from the tower to the main mansion, where a sumptuous banquet was continuing, and was thinking about how badly the heirs of the family were behaving, causing him so much trouble. Sir Ivar walked along the path of small gray stones and thought about how he had been wrong in thinking that his nephews would sit still and quiet. What worried the man most was the thought that these ungrateful teenagers did not even imagine how much effort he was spending to keep them alive, contrary to the wishes of the other viscounts. Jerome remembered that after the death of the Duke and Duchess, it was he who stood between the children and his brothers, refusing to immediately kill the heirs of Serpente and replacing death with imprisonment. Ivar's train of thought was suddenly interrupted by a tall, thin nobleman who stood in his way and asked why he had left the banquet and where he had gone. The Viscount froze in place and turned pale. He had never expected to see this man here. Another aristocrat immediately approached. These were Jerome's brothers, the tall one, Sir Cosimo and the plump one. Sir Gonzalo, they smiled slyly and looked at their relative with an unkind look. Cosimo was the second uncle of the Serpente heirs. He raised his hand and asked irritably if their older brother Ivar had really gone to the bell tower again. Instead of Jerome, the third uncle, named Gonzalo, answered, twirling his thick fingers in the air and suggesting that the relative had come to inspect the children's corpses. The man meekly folded his hands and lowered his head, and then began to justify himself by saying that he had learned of Estelle's illness and intended to call a doctor to see her. The fat relative laughed loudly when he heard this news, but then his face suddenly changed. Gonzalo became angry and remarked that the Viscount must immediately throw this crazy idea out of his head, otherwise unnecessary rumors would start that would bring them all to the grave. Then the man rubbed his chin and noted that the girl's illness could be very convenient, because it was written in her destiny to die at a young age, and the doctors here were just a stupid hindrance. Hearing these words, Jerome tensed up and his brows furrowed. He clearly didn't like his younger brothers, but they had a certain power over him. Sir Ivar turned around to make sure no one was around and replied that he wanted to regain the trust of the children, who had begun to suspect something. Cosimo noted that teenagers learn quickly and probably realized long ago that they had been deceived, so it was necessary to deal with them decisively and ruthlessly. Jerome turned pale and began to nervously scratch his neck, and the brothers concluded that they would only need to enter the tower once to remove the bodies from there. Sir Ivar covered his face with his hand and said that he fully agreed with the will of his relatives, and also asked for forgiveness for such a long delay in resolving this issue. Suddenly, the doors of the mansion swung open, and the butler appeared on the threshold. He apologized for having to interrupt their conversation, and said that Count Bivorio was waiting for them. Sir Cosimo replied that it was time for them to go, And as he left, Sir Gonzalo noted with annoyance that because of his slow elder brother, they had missed part of the banquet. Ivar remained standing at the entrance to the building, and many thoughts were spinning in his head about how he could now help his nephews if his brothers insisted on their death. The man pressed his hands to his chest and began to repeat to himself the idea that he was not guilty of anything, and it was only thanks to his sincere efforts that the heirs of Serpente were still alive. The crown prince stood in the middle of the great hall, all alone, when the door behind him opened, and a voice was heard asking for permission to enter. Crown Prince Adam Avalon turned to the man who had entered and asked if the boy had managed to find the girl. The servant lowered his head and replied that no one had seen the girl with amber hair dressed in a maid's dress. He personally walked around the estate and paid special attention to the balcony where his lordship had seen her. The teenager suggested that the servants could have helped in the search, but the boy assured him that he had spoken to the servants, and they all unanimously assured him that the girl matching the description did not work there. Adam thought for a moment. All this was very strange and mysterious to him, and then the servant suggested that His Highness could have confused this person with someone else. However, the crown prince was firm in his knowledge and noted that he was sure that he had seen this very girl. He remembered her eyes and hair very well. A picture from his distant past came to Avalon's mind when he first saw her. A couple of years ago, the crown prince was visiting his friend Ledias in this very mansion, and then the first heir of Serpente introduced him to an unusual girl named Amelia. Adam was then surprised. Why should he get acquainted with some unknown daughter of a nanny who never had noble roots? To which Letias replied that although they were not related, she was so kind, sweet, and decent that he perceived her as his own sister. And when the crown prince looked into those big and bright eyes, a warm and pleasant feeling appeared inside him, which he still cannot forget. Avalon walked up to the window and put his hand on the glass. He clearly knew that he had seen this very girl today, and therefore ordered to contact the Knights of the Order of Python without unnecessary noise. The sun illuminated the leaves of the trees, but the prisoners in the tower saw little daylight. Amelia rubbed her eyes with her hand and thought about how tired she had been lately. But time moved on, and one day the young people locked in the tower heard the ringing of bells, which indicated that somewhere out there in freedom they were celebrating the new year. The children then decided to return to the practice of marking the days on the wall, to have at least a rough idea of what day or month it was. After the incident with Harris, their diet really changed, and the food became much worse in quality. And now they remembered with longing the old delicacies, which no longer seemed so disgusting and monotonous. But these were not the only changes. There was something else that had never happened before. The chamberlain stopped hiding from them and changing their food when they were sleeping, but began to come when it was convenient for him, and not alone, but with an assistant. During one of these visits, Amelia approached him and asked him to give her a minute of attention, to which the man turned his head and asked displeasedly what she wanted. The maid said that they had run out of all the painkillers that they had brought them earlier, and it had all gone to little Estelle, who could not recover and was suffering every day. The man thought for a moment, and then the girl added that they could use some firewood so that the little lady could warm up, as she was always cold, since they had to conserve their fuel supplies. Then Ledius approached Harris and demanded that the portion of food be changed, at least for his sister, because the girl had a very hard time eating such coarse food, and she constantly broke down into coughing. Seeing that the chamberlain was clenching his teeth and remaining silent, the firstborn raised his voice and demanded immediate obedience from him. But the man did not move from his place and did not say a word. Then the teenager rushed towards him and grabbed him by the collar of his uniform, shouting that his sister was sick and he had to carry out the order. Ledius didn't stop there. He threw Harris to the floor and began to grab him by the hair and try to hit him. The chamberlain wheezed and called his assistant, who immediately rushed to help. The servant grabbed the heir and lifted him up, saying that he was asking him to immediately stop this behavior. A disheveled Harris closed his eyes for a moment and politely asked the heir to calm down, and then suddenly straightened up and stretched for some reason. The man said that he had been irritated by the situation for a long time and thought it was time to put an end to it, and then grabbed the tray with his white-gloved hand and swung it with all his might. The blow from the iron object hit Latias right in the face, causing him to cry out, experiencing sharp pain, and fall to the floor. The chamberlain continued to beat the teenager over and over again, saying that they had no idea how much he did for them and how much he cared about them. Amelia rushed forward and grabbed Harris's arm, begging him to stop beating the serpente air. But the man didn't even think of stopping. Then the maid bit his hand with her teeth, causing him to immediately drop the tray. The chamberlain looked away from Latias and grabbed the girl by the hair with his hand, then pulled her forcefully to the side, saying that she needed to be dealt with first. At that moment, Benja ran into the dining room. He heard the noise and hurried to find out what was going on. The second son picked up a stool from the floor and hit Harris on the head with all his might, causing him to scream, let go of the maid, and immediately lose his balance. The young aristocrat ran up to Amelia and asked how she was feeling, to which she replied that everything was fine. And suddenly, the maid saw something terrible. Her eyes widened and her face twisted into a grimace of horror. The chamberlain stood above them, with his stick raised above his head, and was about to deliver a devastating blow. Latias immediately reacted, covering the girl with his body from the threatening blow. To make the consequences as serious as possible, Harris even ran up during the swing. Amelia felt the teenager's body shake violently from the crushing force put into this attack. The maid felt that the first heir who had been hugging her before became somehow weak and swayed to the side. Latias stepped back and raised his hand, which was immediately covered in blood from his face. The young aristocrat wanted to touch the place of the blow, but he could not because the pain was so strong that he immediately groaned and wheezed. For a moment, there was silence in the dining room. Everyone stood and was silent, and only the firstborn serpente sat on the floor, bleeding and suffering from the injury inflicted on him. Finally, Latias removed his hands from his face, and it became clear that, as a result of the attack, his eye had been damaged, and he could not open it, but blood was flowing from it profusely. Benja and Amelia rushed to help, but they could do nothing to ease his suffering. They only stroked the unfortunate teenager on the shoulders and expressed their sympathy to him. Harris, who also had blood running down his face, stood at some distance and was angry, apparently thinking of killing the boy with one blow. The chamberlain began to shake out his clothes and say that he considered them ungrateful, stupid, and useless creatures who for some unknown reason still thought of themselves as nobles. The young people turned around and began to listen with horror to these difficult words for them. Benja tensed up more than anyone else, clenching his jaw in anger, because this servant clearly put himself above the heirs. Meanwhile, Harris continued to throw mud at the aristocrats and their maid, noting that they would certainly die here or elsewhere, and therefore should accept their fate and resign themselves to it. The second son tried to get up to answer the scoundrel, but Amelia grabbed his hand with force and whispered that the time had not yet come, because now they were vulnerable and the chamberlain was too strong. The girl added that now they need to wait, gather strength and prepare, and if they attack now, they will definitely lose. This servant has been given power over their lives, so they must be careful and attentive to preserve themselves for future victory. The chamberlain noticed how the maid calmed the young teenager's impulse and thought about it. He looked closely at Amelia, who pressed her lips tightly together to keep from saying anything unnecessary. The man then smiled and wished them a good day, after which he and his assistant left the room and disappeared behind a mirrored door. The girl tried to figure out how serious Latias's injury was. She asked him to remove his hands and show her his eye. The teenager groaned and replied that it was very painful, and tears were flowing from his healthy eye. Benja remarked that they should immediately put their elder brother to bed, so that they could at least somehow ease his suffering, and the maid agreed with him. The firstborn was taken into the room and helped to lie down on the bed. Now he looked at the wooden ceiling with his remaining eye and quietly moaned. Amelia closed the door behind her. She went to Estelle to see how she was feeling, but the girl was fast asleep and did not know what was happening on the other floor of the tower. Benja was next to his brother all this time. He saw how the maid entered the room and inquired about the condition of her firstborn. The second son replied that Latias was feeling a little better. His temperature had dropped, and he had finally stopped whining. As for his injured eye, nothing can be said for sure yet, since his younger brother has put a bandage on it, and until it is removed, we can only hope for the best. Suddenly, the young nobleman groaned again, and Amelia and Benja became even more worried about his well-being. The firstborn said that he feels more or less okay, but is very worried about his eye, because what will he do if he loses it? The second son folded his arms across his chest and calmly replied that there was nothing wrong with that. It was just that now the first heir would have a threatening and original appearance. Latias smiled at this thought and added that legends would be made and songs would be sung about the one-eyed Duke Serpent, although most likely no one would know anything and they would simply die here. Benja saw that his older brother was clinging to his active and cheerful nature, but was standing on the brink of despair, and hastened to assure him that they could find freedom. The aristocrat with a bandaged face looked closely at his relative and thought that only faith and hope helped them survive in these conditions. Latias drew an image of himself in his head several years later and imagined how he would destroy everyone who dared to encroach on the health of his loved ones and the wealth of his glorious family. After some time, the firstborn asked what they should do next, and Benja replied that they would either die within these walls or die trying to escape, although he preferred death in battle. Amelia stood nearby and listened as the brothers discussed the rescue plan, the presence of guards outside, and some other unforeseen obstacles on the path to freedom. Finally, the girl joined the dialogue and noted that their main problem was the monster in the guise of their chamberlain. He was much stronger and more experienced, and therefore they should solve this problem. In addition, the maid noted that the food had become much worse lately, which meant that they would recover less strength from it and would be weaker than before if they were fed at all. To this, Benja replied that Harris would not starve them, because there was a good reason for it. Amelia was surprised and asked again what could stop their overseer from mocking them, since he had absolute freedom of action. The maid added that she could not imagine how a commoner, who was capable of hitting an aristocrat and even the heir of a noble family, could stop at anything at all. Benja recalled the undisguised pleasure with which the chamberlain used physical force to suppress resistance, which meant that he enjoyed it. Apparently, the conspirators have given this servant unlimited power over the descendants of Serpente, and Harris likes it very much. However, their death will immediately deprive him of such joy. The second son noticed that this was the main weakness of their enemy, whom they planned to defeat, because in the books that were in the library, the main characters won not by numbers, but by skill. Latias said that he completely agreed with his younger brother regarding the chamberlain. Moreover, he was sure that the servant had dreamed of hitting a nobleman all his life, and now he would hold on to this opportunity. The young men then agreed to behave submissively so that Harris would feel his power to the fullest extent, and then when he relaxed, they would deliver their crushing blow. The firstborn pointed in the direction of the stairs and noticed that some of the rungs and side posts were strong enough to become weapons if only their ends could be treated. The brothers then began to suggest different types of weapons that they could make with their own hands, and the maid remarked that they must choose the right day to attack. Benja remembered that in early spring, their family usually celebrated a family holiday, which meant there would be a banquet, a ball, and the servants would be busy with various things. The mansion will be visited by many guests, both neighbors and from afar, so no one will care about the prisoners in the tower, and this is their chance. And when the aristocrats are immersed in the merriment and the servants begin to run fussily between the kitchen and the guest hall, they will make their escape, but first they should prepare and think everything through. A few weeks later, one late evening, Harris and his assistant were as usual pushing carts up to the tower and chatting cheerfully about the upcoming evening. The man was in a good mood. He enjoyed these regular visits, during which he received something more than just good pay for silence and dirty work. The chamberlain told his colleague that before he was disgusted by dealing with heirs, but now everything is different because the pathetic nobles tremble before him, a powerful commoner. The servant smiled as he remembered the submissive teenagers, obedient and humiliated, ready to carry out his own orders and humbly accept their fate. Then, Harris added that mocking refined aristocrats is truly a heavenly pleasure for a commoner, and therefore he wants to quickly find himself at the top of the bell tower. The man walked through the mirrored door and grabbed the door handle leading to the kitchen, leaving the assistant to fiddle with the cart in the hallway. However, in the kitchen, there was only a frightened Amelia, which somewhat surprised the chamberlain because usually young people preferred to stick together. However, he decided that he would start with her alone. And at that very moment, Letias was already sneaking up behind the villain, holding his noose belt at the ready and waiting for the right moment and signal to attack. The chamberlain smiled broadly, anticipating how his victim would scream and beg for mercy, which he would not give her, because the prisoners in the tower did not deserve any mercy. But as soon as Harris got close enough to Amelia, she shouted that it was time and saw how the teenager rushed into the attack with lightning speed. The servant froze in place in surprise, and the next moment a wide loop of leather belt was thrown around his neck. He did not even immediately realize what exactly had happened to him. Lydias jumped on the chamberlain's neck and then pulled the free end of the noose belt as hard as he could. He didn't want to give his opponent a single chance, so he tried his best. The man croaked a curse at Serpente's firstborn and reached for his neck to loosen the wide noose that was tightly squeezing his throat. Hearing the scream, Harris's assistant immediately came running from the corridor and immediately rushed to the aid of his superior. He was outraged by the disobedient behavior of the tower's prisoners. The young servant clearly shared the chamberlain's passion for bullying, and so he covered Lydias with choice abuse and tried to do something, but he did not know that a severe punishment was in store for him. Benja stabbed him in the eye with a steel-tipped fountain pen, causing him to scream and wave his arms high. The iron tip went deep into the target, and the younger brother's face was immediately splashed with someone else's blood. The assistant taken out of the fight immediately lost his desire to fight and began to slowly feel the space around him. But Harris was still struggling with Lydias, trying to throw the boy off himself. The chamberlain looked at the young men with undisguised anger. He realized that he had made a mistake, and that in recent weeks they had only pretended to submit to his will so that he would lose his vigilance. Lydias looked at his enemy and remembered all those long months of humiliation and imprisonment to which Harris had a direct relation because he actively helped the traitors. Benja and Amelia stood nearby, ready to come to the aid of their firstborn at any moment, while their gaze showed a firm determination to follow the chosen path to the very end. Meanwhile, the eldest son continued to strangle their tormentor, and this turned out to be a very difficult task, because the man was a strong and powerful person. At the same time, Lydias tried to squeeze the servant's chest with his legs to make it harder for him to move, but Harris had enough strength to continue actively waving his arms, trying to grab the boy. At some point, Amelia decided that she couldn't just stand by, picked up a large heavy candlestick from the floor, and hit the chamberlain on the head with it as hard as she could. The man immediately gasped from the strong blow, and losing consciousness, fell to the floor. He no longer offered any resistance and seemed completely defenseless. Lydias continued to strangle Harris, who was lying on the floor for some time, and then said that he was already dead, but there was no certainty in his voice, and it sounded more like an assumption. Benja replied that he would finish with him and asked his older brother and Amelia to go get Estelle to get her out of here, because they had to act as quickly as possible. The maid agreed and thought about how exactly the second son would complete his affairs with the chamberlain. However, she did not want to go too deeply into the details of this bloody process. When the young people left the dining room and the door closed behind them, the second heir of Serpente approached the lying servant and began to speak. Benja didn't know whether the enemy was dead or simply unconscious, but it was obvious that he was now weaker than ever, which meant there was an opportunity to repay him for his betrayal once and for all. The younger son had no intention of giving a eulogy, but merely recalled how Harris had treated them all this time, and there was a lot to recall. These were harsh words about indifference bullying and enjoying the humiliation of others, and also a reminder that the heir himself did not feel any personal animosity towards the enemy. Finally, Benya added that every person, commoner or nobleman, makes a choice in his life, the consequences of which will certainly make themselves known, if not today, then tomorrow. From the top floor, carefully descending the stairs, came Amelia and Lydias. With them was Estelle, the girl quietly moaning with every movement and quietly crying. The firstborn carried his younger sister on his shoulders, carefully stepping on each step in front of his feet. He understood that her life now directly depended on him. Benja came out to them holding a lantern in his bloody hand, and when they asked him what was wrong with Harris, the teenager replied that he would never bother them again. Then the younger brother shone the light down the steps and said that it was only a short time left, because they had been waiting for this moment for many months of their imprisonment. Of course, there could be other servants outside covering the chamberlain and his assistant, while they changed food in the tower or other doors locked or bolted from the outside. There might even have been heavily armed guards who answered only to the conspirators and had orders to kill the children if they tried to leave their prison. In addition, Estelle needs serious medical care. During this time, her health has deteriorated so much that the brothers were even worried whether the doctors would be able to do anything. Amelia thought about all this, and she was very worried because their rescue plan could still fail at any moment. Finally, they reached the mirrored door, with a bright white light coming from it, and Benja smiled, reminding them that the first part of their plan was almost complete. The girl stopped and looked at the passage with wide open eyes. She had waited for this moment for so long, had overcome so many obstacles, that now she simply could not believe her eyes. Tears appeared in Amelia's eyes, and inside there was determination, and the realization that even if they died in 5 minutes, she would not regret anything because they tried and fought as best they could. And the young people headed towards the door, behind which absolute uncertainty awaited them. The light was so bright that it literally enveloped the heirs of Serpente and the girl with amber eyes. And at some point, Amelia was even forced to close one eye to somehow muffle this bright stream of white clear glow, but with the other, she continued to look and firmly walked forward.